Hey guys, tonight we are going somewhere very old. Not old in the comfortable way of ruined castles, Roman roads, or forgotten villages. We are going so far back that even the things we normally use to measure civilization begin to disappear. No writing, no cities, no kings, not even pottery. And yet, waiting for us on a lonely hill in southeastern Anatolia, there are enormous pillars of stone. So, if you enjoy these quiet journeys into the stranger corners of history, you can leave a like, subscribe, or tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Maybe you are awake beneath the rain in London, somewhere warm in Sydney, or listening from a dark room while the rest of your house has gone quiet. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the modern world become a little less important. Because our story begins roughly 11,600 years ago, and there is something on the hill that should not be there. The sun has not been up for long. Across the limestone country of southeastern Anatolia, the morning light arrives pale and dry. Low grasses bend beneath the breeze. Somewhere below the ridge, animals move through the plain. Gazelles gather in nervous groups. Birds circle in the enormous blue sky. The air smells of dust, crushed grass, and stone warmed after a cold night. There is no Turkey, there is no nearby city of Şanlıurfa. There is no border with Syria. There are no countries at all. If you could stand here, you would be living in a world whose maps exist only in human memory. People know the valleys, they know the springs. They know which slopes hold pistachios, which paths are used by animals, and where wild grain grows thick enough to make gathering worthwhile. A child may learn these places from a parent, who learned them from another parent, in a chain of memory stretching farther backward than anyone can count. But there is something unusual on the hill. People are cutting stone. Not little flakes for arrowheads, not ordinary slabs for a hearth. They are cutting enormous pieces of limestone directly from the bedrock. One of those stones is longer than a person is tall. Another is heavier than several large animals combined. Men and women work around it with stone tools. Flint strikes limestone. Hammerstones rise and fall. Dust gathers on arms and hair. The work is slow enough to test the patience of almost anyone born into our hurried world. There are no steel chisels. There are no cranes. There are no wheeled carts waiting nearby. There are only hands, ropes, wood, stone, patience, and whatever system of cooperation these people understand so well that they can persuade many human beings to spend their valuable time moving a rock that cannot feed anybody. That last detail is important. These people still depend heavily on hunting and gathering. Food cannot simply be ordered, purchased, or pulled from a permanent warehouse. Someone has to find it. Someone has to hunt. Someone has to collect grain, nuts, fruits, and roots. Someone has to carry water. And every person working on this strange hill is a person temporarily not doing one of those things, yet the stone moves, slowly. Perhaps it rests on a wooden sledge. Perhaps ropes tighten around it. Perhaps voices call together so everyone pulls at once. We do not know exactly, no builder has left us instructions, but eventually the pillar reaches its destination. A prepared enclosure waits for it. The stone is shaped like a great letter T. Its sides have been smoothed, its form is deliberate, and somehow, with methods we can only partly reconstruct, the builders raise it upright. Then they do it again, and again. Around the enclosure, smaller pillars stand in a ring. At the center are two larger ones. They face inward like silent figures attending a meeting that began before history. Some carry animals on their surfaces: foxes, boars, snakes, birds, scorpions. Other marks are harder to understand. Shapes repeat without explaining themselves. There are no written captions. There is no helpful stone tablet saying what everything means. The people working here live thousands of years before anything we would comfortably call a written historical record. And this is why Göbekli Tepe is such an unsettling place. It gives us evidence without giving us explanations. Then, thousands upon thousands of years pass, the builders vanish, their languages vanish, their stories vanish. Whatever names they gave the animals on the pillars disappear with them. The hill remains, wind passes over it, rain falls, plants grow. People live and die nearby. Kingdoms eventually appear in lands, These builders could never have imagined. Armies cross Anatolia. Merchants travel its roads, religions rise, empires expand and collapse. The stone circles remain hidden. By the 20th century, the place looks remarkably ordinary. Locally, the hill becomes known as Göbekli Tepe, usually translated as something like Potbelly Hill, and that is almost funny. One of the most extraordinary prehistoric sites ever discovered spends centuries disguised beneath a name that sounds pleasantly unimpressive. A rounded hill. Some broken stone, fields nearby, sheep, wind, nothing that announces. Civilization has left one of its oldest puzzles beneath your feet. During the early 1960s, researchers surveying the region notice archaeological material here. They see flint, they see limestone, but the importance of the site is not understood. Some of the exposed stones are interpreted in connection with a much later cemetery, and the researchers move on. It is easy with hindsight to imagine ourselves standing behind them shouting, "Dig there, look again." You have no idea what is underneath you. But archaeology does not work with hindsight. A landscape like this contains the remains of countless human lives. Broken pottery, stone fragments, ruined structures, graves, tools, and disturbed earth can appear almost everywhere. Most hills do not conceal something capable of changing textbooks, so Göbekli Tepe waits, another generation passes. Then, in the 1990s, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt begins looking again. Schmidt has experience with prehistoric sites in the region, and when he examines the material scattered across this hill, he sees something different. The flint does not seem medieval. It belongs to a much older world. The stones do not look like ordinary grave markers, and the hill itself begins to feel wrong. Not sinister, just wrong in the quiet archaeological sense. Its shape does not seem entirely natural. There is too much human material, too much stone, too much possibility. Excavation begins during the middle of the decade, and the hill opens. Imagine removing soil carefully, layer after layer, expecting perhaps the remains of an ancient settlement. Then a stone edge appears, you follow it, it continues downward. Another stone emerges nearby, then another. Gradually, the shape becomes unmistakable. These are pillars. Huge pillars. And they are still standing. The soil has not merely covered scattered ruins, it has surrounded architecture. Circular and oval enclosures emerge from the earth. Walls appear. Carved animals return to daylight after an absence so long that almost the entire story of what we call civilization has happened while they were underground. Then comes the dating. Organic material associated with the site allows researchers to use radiocarbon analysis. The earliest monumental phases belong to approximately the 10th millennium before the Common Era. Put more gently, they reach back around 11,600 years. That creates a problem. A wonderful problem because Göbekli Tepe is far older than Stonehenge, far older than the Great Pyramids of Egypt, far older than the classical civilizations whose ruined temples fill history books. It belongs to the pre-pottery Neolithic. Even the name tells you how strange the situation is. Pre-pottery. People are constructing monumental stone architecture before pottery has become a normal part of life here. And according to an older, wonderfully tidy version of human history, this is happening in the wrong order. The traditional story once seemed straightforward. First, human beings hunt and gather. Then they discover agriculture. Agriculture creates reliable food surpluses. Surpluses allow larger permanent settlements. Permanent settlements produce specialists, leaders, priests, organized labor, and eventually monumental architecture. Food first, temple later. It is a clean staircase leading upward towards civilization. Göbekli Tepe walks into that staircase and removes several steps. The people associated with its earliest phases are still heavily dependent on wild resources. They hunt gazelle and other animals. They collect and process wild plants. Full agricultural village life, in the form familiar from later Neolithic communities, has not yet taken over. And still they organize, still they quarry, still they carve, still they gather, still they raise pillars weighing many tons. That forces an uncomfortable possibility into the room. Perhaps organized ritual did not simply appear after settled civilization. Perhaps gathering for ritual helped create the conditions that encouraged people to settle. Maybe people did not build monumental places because they had already become farmers. Maybe, at least in part, they began changing the way they lived because monumental places gave them reasons to gather. Imagine returning to the same hill every season. Your relatives come from one direction. Another group arrives from beyond the plain. Others follow rivers or animal routes. There is food, there are stories, there are marriages to arrange. Old disagreements to settle, hunts to organize. Perhaps there are ceremonies whose meanings have disappeared entirely. And standing above all of this are stones that required cooperation to create. A monument does something peculiar to human memory. A spoken promise can be forgotten. A person can die. A camp can disappear within a season, but a pillar remains. Your grandfather saw it. Your mother saw it. Now you see it. Eventually your children will see it. Stone turns memory into landscape, which makes what happens next much stranger, because the builders and their descendants do not simply abandon these enclosures. The evidence uncovered by archaeologists suggests that major structures were deliberately filled. Material was carried into them. Limestone rubble, flint, animal bones, debris. The open spaces disappeared beneath accumulated backfill. The pillars remained inside. Imagine spending years shaping something from bedrock. Imagine generations gathering around it. Imagine knowing the stories attached to every animal carved across its surface. Then imagine deciding that nobody should stand there anymore. You do not smash the pillars, you do not drag them away, you bury them. Carefully enough that thousands of years later, archaeologists find some still standing. And suddenly the discovery of Göbekli Tepe becomes two mysteries instead of one. The first is how hunter-gathering communities created something so monumental at such an early date. The second is why later people chose to close it. Perhaps burial was practical, perhaps old structures became unstable, perhaps filling them allowed new construction nearby, perhaps the rituals changed, perhaps the communities themselves changed as farming and permanent settlements became increasingly important, or perhaps burying the enclosures was itself a ritual, a funeral in a sense, not for a human being but for a place. We should be careful here. The stones are evidence, the fill is evidence, the carvings are evidence, the motives are interpretation. Göbekli Tepe has attracted dramatic theories precisely because silence invites imagination. But archaeology becomes most interesting when we resist the urge to make the mystery easier than it really is. The people who built this place were not waiting for us to understand them. They did not carve explanations for future museums. They lived inside a world of meaning that felt obvious to them and has become almost completely invisible to us. We have the objects, we have the architecture. We have animal bones and stone tools and layers of soil. But the songs are gone, the names are gone, the jokes are gone. The arguments between exhausted workers dragging a limestone pillar across the hill are gone. And perhaps that is the first quiet lesson of Göbekli Tepe. Civilization does not begin when people suddenly become intelligent. The human beings living here already possess patience, imagination, memory, cooperation, and symbolic thought. What changes is how those abilities are arranged. For a while, on this lonely hill, they are arranged around enormous circles of stone. And before we can understand why anyone would choose to bury those circles, we have to meet the people who built them. Not primitive shadows, not cartoon cavemen people, hunters returning beneath a red evening sky, gatherers carrying baskets of wild grain, children recognizing distant relatives arriving along familiar paths, older men and women remembering ceremonies performed when they themselves were young. And somewhere among them, perhaps, a person looks toward the unfinished limestone pillar lying in the quarry and knows exactly what it is supposed to become. We do not know that person's name, we never will. But the stone is still here, and for tonight that is enough. To understand the people who raised those silent pillars, it helps to forget one of the oldest pictures we carry around in our heads. Forget the wandering caveman. Forget the lonely family stumbling through an empty wilderness, dressed in rough animal skins and thinking only about the next meal. The people living around Göbekli Tepe are hunter-gatherers, certainly. But those two words can make their lives sound much simpler than they really are. Their world is not empty. It is mapped, not with ink, not on parchment, but in memory. A person growing up in this landscape learns where water gathers after winter rain. They know which slopes warm first in spring. They recognize the valleys where gazelle are likely to pass, and the rocky places where wild sheep can be found. They know when pistachios ripen, where stands of wild cereal grow, and which distant smoke rising beyond a ridge probably belongs to friends rather than strangers. The landscape is a calendar, and every season turns another page. When the rains change, people move. When plants ripen, they return. When animals migrate, hunters wait along familiar routes. This is not aimless wandering, it is movement guided by generations of accumulated knowledge. You might leave one camp knowing that several weeks later, you will reach another place where relatives are already waiting. Months afterward, your path may bring you back toward the same spring your family visited the previous year. And eventually, perhaps, toward the rounded hill where great stones stand. Göbekli Tepe exists within this moving world. That matters because building it requires something more complicated than strength. It requires people to arrive. Many people. Perhaps different communities come at particular times of year. One group travels from the plain, another comes through the uplands. Others may have journeyed much farther. We cannot reconstruct their routes with certainty, but archaeological evidence from the wider region shows that prehistoric communities were connected across surprising distances. Materials such as obsidian moved through networks of exchange. People were not sealed inside little worlds. Objects traveled, and where objects traveled, ideas traveled with them. Stories traveled, people married. News passed between groups. Perhaps songs did too, so imagine the hill during one of its busier seasons. For most of the year, it may be relatively quiet. Wind moves through the grass. Birds settle on exposed stone. Then people begin appearing along the paths. Small groups at first, someone recognizes a cousin. Someone else sees an old hunting companion. Children stare at visitors they barely remember from the previous gathering. Bundles are lowered onto the ground. Tools are unpacked. Fires begin to smoke. The smell of roasted meat drifts across the slope. Archaeologists have recovered large quantities of animal remains at Göbekli Tepe, especially gazelle, along with wild boar, wild sheep, and other species. Many bones carry traces associated with butchery and consumption. This is one reason feasting has become such an important part of interpretations of the site. A feast is never merely calories. Even today, people understand this without thinking about it. Important events gather around food: weddings, funerals, religious festivals. Reunions. Peace after an argument. Promises between families. The meal is useful because everybody must eat, but its meaning comes from eating together. For communities living more than 11,000 years ago, a large feast could perform many jobs at once. Hunters demonstrate generosity. Families renew alliances. Young people meet potential partners. Visitors exchange information about distant valleys. Arguments can be settled. Debts remembered. Perhaps obligations are created that will not be repaid until the next season. And somewhere in the middle of all this social life waits the stone. The scale of the construction tells us that cooperation is happening. A single person cannot casually lift one of the largest pillars. A small family cannot easily quarry, shape, transport, and erect an entire monumental enclosure while also obtaining enough food to survive. Labor has to be coordinated. That does not necessarily mean a king is standing nearby shouting commands. There is no good evidence for a king at Göbekli Tepe. No palace, no throne, no written list of workers. No royal tomb announcing that one powerful ruler ordered the hill into existence. Organization can exist without monarchy. A respected elder might coordinate one task. A skilled stoneworker might direct another. A hunter with knowledge of animal movements might organize the feast. Someone who remembers rituals may decide when particular actions must occur. Leadership can move between people depending on what needs to be done. And the work itself must have been exhausting. Picture a limestone block lying partly freed from the bedrock. The sun is higher now. Stone dust coats damp skin. A worker kneels beside the cut, striking again and again with tools that would seem painfully modest beside a modern quarry. There is no engine humming nearby. Every groove represents effort. Every removed piece has been struck, chipped, loosened, or carried. The pillar slowly separates from the earth. Then comes the difficult part, moving it. Researchers still debate exactly how the builders transported and raised the largest stones. Wooden sledges, ropes, rollers, prepared surfaces, ramps, levers, and combinations of these techniques are all possibilities. What matters is that somehow it was done. The lack of modern machinery does not make the achievement impossible. It makes coordination essential. A rope tightens, bodies lean, feet slide against dusty ground. Someone calls the rhythm. The stone shifts slightly, then stops again. The workers pull again. Perhaps someone laughs when another falls backward into the dirt. It is worth remembering that prehistoric labor does not need to be imagined as endless grim silence. These are human beings. People complain. People tease one another. People become bored. Someone probably believes the plan is foolish. Someone else is certain they know a better way. An older worker may remember how the previous pillar was moved and insist everyone is doing it incorrectly this time. The voices are lost. But human nature makes the silence of the archaeological site deceptive. The hill must once have been noisy, stone against stone, fire cracking, dogs perhaps, moving around the edges of camp. Children, arguments, the cutting of meat, footsteps. And during certain moments, maybe silence, a ceremony begins. People enter an enclosure. The walls partly separate them from the ordinary activity outside. Smaller T-shaped pillars form a ring. Two larger pillars stand in the center. The central stones are especially strange. Carved arms run down their sides. Hands rest across the front. Belts appear around their bodies. Some seem to wear garments. There are no recognizable faces, yet they seem human, or almost human. That difference matters. If the builders wanted to carve ordinary people, they were capable of representing bodies and animals. Instead, these central pillars are reduced to something simpler and more imposing. A body without an individual face. A presence without a portrait. Perhaps they represent ancestors, perhaps supernatural beings, perhaps mythical figures whose stories everyone attending the gathering already knows, or perhaps our categories are too neat. The people who built Göbekli Tepe may not have divided their world into the same boxes we do: human, animal, ancestor, spirit, place. For them, those categories may have overlapped. A fox carved into limestone might be an animal and a story and a group identity at the same time. A pillar might represent a person without representing any single human being. We have to accept uncertainty. But there is one thing the stones reveal quite clearly. These people think symbolically. They plan beyond the immediate moment. They can imagine a structure before it exists and organize labor to make that imagined structure real. And this brings us back to agriculture. The landscape around Göbekli Tepe lies within the broader Fertile Crescent, one of the regions where humans eventually domesticate important plants and animals. Wild ancestors of wheat grow in this part of the world. People already collect and process cereals. Grinding stones and related tools show that plant foods matter. But domestication is not a single morning when somebody wakes up and invents farming. It is painfully slow. At first, perhaps people simply gather grain. Then they begin returning to especially productive patches. Seeds fall near camps. Plants with characteristics useful to humans are gathered more often. People may begin clearing competing vegetation. Perhaps they deliberately scatter seed. Generation after generation, human behavior changes the plants, while the plants change human behavior. The relationship becomes harder to leave. A wild food source asks you to follow it. A cultivated food source asks you to remain nearby and care for it. And this creates an intriguing possibility around Göbekli Tepe. Large gatherings require food, a lot of food. If many groups come together to feast, work, and perform ceremonies, somebody has to feed them. Hunting can provide enormous quantities of meat, especially when animals are seasonally abundant. Wild cereals can be gathered and processed, but repeated gatherings create predictable demand, and predictable demand rewards predictable food production. Perhaps ritual gathering and early cultivation begin reinforcing one another. People return because the hill matters. Because they return, securing food around the gathering place becomes increasingly useful. Because food becomes increasingly reliable, larger gatherings become possible. The old story says farming produces temples. Göbekli Tepe leaves room for a more complicated story. Maybe temples, or whatever we choose to call these strange enclosures, helped produce farmers. Not alone, not suddenly, but as one pressure among many. The idea is strangely beautiful. Human beings may have begun changing their relationship with the natural world, partly because they wanted to keep meeting one another, to feast, to remember, to perform ceremonies, to stand beneath carved animals and repeat stories inherited from people already dead. Food feeds ritual. Ritual encourages gathering. Gathering demands more food. And somewhere within that circle, the first steps toward a more settled existence become easier to take. Yet settlement brings consequences. The more time you invest in one place, the more that place owns a piece of your future. A field needs attention. Stored grain needs protection. Animals under human management need care. A house needs repair. Mobility slowly becomes more difficult. The calendar that once sent families across wide territories begins tightening around smaller spaces, and perhaps the hill feels the change. At first, Göbekli Tepe may be a solution to distance. Scattered communities need somewhere to gather. A permanent monument provides an anchor. You may spend much of the year elsewhere, but the stone remains. It waits for everyone. Later, permanent villages begin performing some of the same social work. Your relatives are no longer several days away. They live nearby. Food is stored close to home. Ritual can happen inside settlements. Communal buildings can stand among houses. The distant hill is no longer the only place where memory can become architecture. This transition does not happen overnight. For generations, old and new ways of life overlap. A person might hunt gazelle while also tending plants. A family might spend part of the year in one settlement and another part moving through older seasonal routes. A ritual inherited from grandparents might continue even when the economic world that created it is disappearing. History often changes this way, quietly, one habit at a time, until people look around and realize that the world of their childhood no longer quite exists. Perhaps something similar happens at Göbekli Tepe. The enclosures remain meaningful. The pillars still stand, but the communities gathering around them are becoming different communities. Their food is changing. Their movements are changing. Their homes are changing. Their relationships with animals and plants are changing. And eventually, the question is no longer how to build another great circle. The question becomes what to do with the old ones. This is where the mystery of burial begins to feel more human. Imagine an enclosure already old when you are born. Your grandparents tell you that their grandparents entered it. The carvings belong to stories older than anyone can remember. Perhaps fewer people gather there now. Perhaps another building has taken its place. A wall needs repair, a pillar leans, rainwater gathers where it should not, the old ceremonies are performed less often, then somebody proposes filling the enclosure, not destroying it, filling it. There may be resistance, there may be agreement, perhaps there is a final feast, perhaps there is no dramatic ceremony at all, we do not know, but eventually rubble begins falling around the pillars, stone fragments, soil, bones, flint, material accumulated through years of human activity. The floor slowly disappears, then the lower carvings, then the hands on the pillars, then the belts. The great central figures become shorter as earth rises around them, until finally even their heads disappear. The enclosure is gone, but it has not truly been destroyed. That is the strange thing. Burial protects. The same act that removes a monument from human sight can preserve it against wind, rain, reuse, and destruction. The builders could not have known that archaeologists would uncover these stones many thousands of years later. But their decision ensured that parts of Göbekli Tepe survived with remarkable clarity. They hid the monument from their own world, and in doing so, they delivered it into ours. The irony is almost too neat. The reason we can ask why Göbekli Tepe was buried is partly because somebody buried it well enough for the question to survive tonight. As the imaginary fire on the ancient hill burns lower, keep that thought nearby. These people stand at the edge of one of the greatest transformations in human history. Behind them lies an unimaginably long tradition of hunting, gathering, seasonal movement and landscapes carried in memory. Ahead of them lie farms, villages, stored grain, domesticated animals. Eventually towns, walls, rulers, writing, taxes, armies, and all the complicated machinery we later call civilization. But they cannot see any of that. They are simply living, eating, working, remembering, making decisions that seem sensible in their own moment. And somewhere on the hill, two faceless pillars stand beneath the open sky, watching a world slowly change around them. Soon, we will leave these workers and their fires behind. We will move closer to the stones themselves, into the circles where foxes run across limestone, snakes twist through carved surfaces, and enormous human-shaped figures wait without eyes or mouths. Because if we want to understand why this place was eventually put beneath the earth, we first need to ask what these silent beings might have meant while they were still standing beneath the sun. Let us leave the fading fires of the gathering behind and move closer to the stone. The morning is cool now. A pale light spreads across the hill, touching the upper edges of the pillars before reaching the ground below. Dust hangs in the shallow enclosure. Somewhere beyond the walls, a bird calls across the plain. You step downward, and immediately the scale of the place changes from outside. The enclosure is simply a hollow in the earth. From within, the pillars rise around you like a silent gathering. They are not enormous by the standards of later civilizations. Egypt will eventually raise monuments far taller. Roman engineers will move heavier blocks. Medieval builders will send cathedral towers high above European towns. But none of those people are here yet. There is no Egypt of the pharaohs. There is no Rome. There is no Canterbury Cathedral, no medieval York, no stone castles in Normandy. There is not even a Stonehenge. Those things belong to a future so distant that imagining them from this hill would be almost impossible. Here, near the beginning of the Neolithic world, the achievement feels different, because almost everything has to begin with stone. The hill itself provides the raw material. Göbekli Tepe stands on limestone, and the ancient builders understand that limestone intimately. They know where it fractures. They know which surfaces can be worked. They know how a blow travels through the rock. This is knowledge that probably does not belong to one clever inventor. It belongs to generations. A child watches adults shape flint. Later, the child learns to strike it. Hands become familiar with angles and pressure. Mistakes become lessons. Techniques pass from one person to another without ever being written down. Then somebody applies that accumulated knowledge on a much larger scale. Instead of making a blade small enough to hold in one hand, people begin separating great pillars from the bedrock. Traces of quarrying around Göbekli Tepe help archaeologists understand where some of this work took place. The process is slow. Workers first have to define the shape. Grooves are cut around the future pillar. Stone tools bite into softer limestone again and again, not dramatically. There is no single heroic blow that frees the monument. Instead, there are thousands of small impacts. Tap, scrape, strike, clear the dust, strike again. The sound repeats until it becomes part of the day. Imagine kneeling there. Your hands are sore, fine pale powder settles into the creases of your skin. The sun climbs higher, someone brings water, another person takes your place. Perhaps the work continues in shifts. The pillar slowly emerges from the rock, as though the builders are uncovering something they believe has always been waiting inside. Eventually, only the underside remains attached. This is the dangerous moment. A mistake can split the stone. A crack in the wrong place might ruin days or weeks of work, and there is no hardware shop beyond the hill where another pillar can be ordered. If it breaks, you begin again. Some unfinished stones around prehistoric quarry areas remind us that ancient engineering included failure. Not every project succeeded. Not every block survived. Archaeology often preserves finished monuments so beautifully that we forget the frustration required to create them. Somewhere in the long history of Göbekli Tepe, somebody almost certainly watched a stone crack and felt their stomach sink. Perhaps everyone became very quiet. Then came the prehistoric equivalent of a long, exhausted sigh. And tomorrow they return to work. Once a pillar is freed, another problem begins. It has to move. Some of the monumental stones weigh many tons. The builders have no wheeled transport that we can confidently place into this construction process. There are no domesticated teams of oxen waiting with harnesses. Human beings provide the essential power. Exactly how they do it remains uncertain. This is worth emphasizing because ancient monuments often attract strange explanations whenever the original engineering is not completely documented. But uncertainty does not mean impossibility. Human beings can move astonishing weights using simple machines, preparation, cooperation, and patience. Wooden sledges may have helped. Ropes made from plant fibers or other materials may have been used. Logs could potentially reduce friction in suitable situations. Levers allow small movements to become useful. Earth ramps can turn a difficult vertical problem into a longer horizontal one. Wet or prepared surfaces can change how a load slides. We do not know the exact recipe used on every pillar, we know the result. The stones moved. So picture one of them beginning its journey. Ropes stretch from the limestone block. A group gathers, someone checks the path ahead. Loose stones have been removed. Perhaps the surface has been prepared. People take their positions. The first pull does almost nothing. Bodies lean forward, muscles tighten, feet dig into the soil. Another call, another pull, then the pillar shifts. Only slightly, but slightly is enough. A stone does not need to fly. It only needs to move a little farther than it did before. The process repeats. Again, again, again. There may be 20 people involved. There may be far more. We should not pretend to know the exact number. What matters is coordination. If everyone pulls whenever they please, effort is wasted. If everyone moves together, human bodies become a machine. This is technology too. Not metal, not gears. Organization. And organization may be one of Göbekli Tepe's greatest achievements. Eventually, the pillar reaches the enclosure. Now it must stand. A socket or prepared foundation waits below. The builders need to lower one end toward that position while raising the other. Perhaps earth is piled into a ramp. Perhaps ropes control the movement. Perhaps wooden levers help inch the stone upward. The pillar tilts. People shout. Someone gets out of the way quickly. Ropes strain. For one uncomfortable moment, several tons of limestone seem to balance between success and disaster. Then the lower end settles. The pillar rises, higher, higher, until finally it stands. Imagine the silence immediately afterward. Not because ancient people are naturally solemn, but because even now, after watching a difficult object finally settle into place, people often stop. There is relief in completion. Then perhaps someone cheers. Perhaps food appears. Perhaps the workers simply sit down because their backs hurt. What they have raised is more than a structural support. The shape itself seems meaningful. The famous pillars of Göbekli Tepe resemble a capital letter T. At first glance, that can seem abstract. A vertical shaft, a horizontal top. Simple, but the carvings complicate things. On several pillars, arms run down the sides, hands meet toward the front, belts cross the lower portion. Garments appear beneath them. Suddenly the shape becomes a body. The horizontal top can be understood as a head, seen in highly simplified form. The long shaft becomes a torso. These are not merely stones, they appear to be beings. And the two central pillars inside several major enclosures are especially imposing. They stand larger than the surrounding ring. If the smaller pillars are a gathering, the central pair seem to be the focus, but they have no faces. No carved eyes watch you. No mouth speaks. No expression tells you whether they are peaceful, angry, protective, or dead. They are human enough to recognize and strange enough to resist recognition. That blankness may be accidental to our interpretation. Perhaps the builders did not need faces. Perhaps identity existed in the belt, the posture, the accompanying animals, or something else we fail to notice. Or perhaps facelessness was exactly the point. A face makes someone particular. This nose, those eyes. That person, a faceless body can become something broader, an ancestor, a category, a being, a presence. Standing inside the enclosure, you may have felt watched without seeing a single pair of carved eyes. Around the central figures, other pillars form a ring. This arrangement controls space. Your body has limited places to go. The walls define an inside and an outside. Entrances and passages guide movement. The surrounding pillars draw attention toward the center. Architecture is doing what good architecture always does. It is telling your body how to behave without speaking. Think of walking into a cathedral thousands of years later. The doorway narrows your entrance, the ceiling lifts your gaze, the aisle carries you forward, light directs attention toward particular places. Göbekli Tepe is not a cathedral, of course, and we should not force later religious categories onto it. But the basic human manipulation of space is already present. The builders understand that stone can shape experience. A hill is open, an enclosure is controlled. Outside you can wander. Inside you enter according to a plan. Perhaps only certain people enter. Perhaps everyone does. Perhaps ceremonies happen at night, when firelight moves across the carved surfaces. Imagine that. Darkness covers the hill. Inside the enclosure, flames flicker. A fox carved in shallow relief seems to move whenever the light changes. A snake appears and disappears. The faceless central pillars loom above the people gathered below. Smoke rises, voices become quieter. A story begins, we cannot hear it. This is one of archaeology's cruel little limitations. It can recover the room, but not the conversation. It can show us where people stood without telling us what they said, and so we study the room. The enclosures are not identical. Some are larger. Some contain different arrangements and different carved imagery. Construction changes over time. That suggests Göbekli Tepe is not created according to one perfect master plan and then frozen forever. It develops. People modify things, they build new spaces, they alter old ones, they fill some, they create others. The hill has a biography that is easy to forget when looking at photographs of ancient ruins. A photograph freezes everything into one moment. Human life does not work that way. Imagine your own home after several generations. A wall is moved, a doorway is closed, a roof repaired, a room changes purpose. Someone adds something considered beautiful. Someone later removes it because fashions have changed. Now stretch that process across centuries. The people using Göbekli Tepe may inherit structures whose original builders are already ancestors. A young worker helping repair an enclosure might know that a particular pillar is ancient even to them. Perhaps nobody remembers exactly who first carved it. Stories explain, stories change. One generation says the fox represents one thing. Several generations later, perhaps the explanation shifts. The stone remains stable while meaning moves around it. And then new pillars are carved, new animals appear. Old arrangements are copied, but not perfectly. Tradition continues through variation. This makes the site feel less like a monument and more like a conversation conducted over generations. One group speaks in limestone, another answers, another edits, another buries, and the central figures continue standing through all of it. There is something almost intimate about the carved hands. They rest across the front of the body. The gesture is controlled, calm. The hands do not hold weapons. They do not appear to be lifting tools. They simply rest. Perhaps this posture communicated dignity, perhaps death, perhaps authority, perhaps nothing we have a word for. But whoever carved those fingers cared enough to make them visible. A stoneworker leaned close to the limestone and created each line. That worker had fingernails, breath, a sore shoulder. Perhaps children, perhaps a favorite food. Perhaps someone waiting for them at a camp below the hill. This is where monumental archaeology becomes human again. We talk about pillars weighing many tons because weight impresses us. We talk about dates because dates organize history. But every carved line is an action performed by a person. Someone made the fox's tail. Someone smoothed the edge of the belt. Someone stood back and decided whether the result was good enough, and perhaps someone else complained. We cannot recover those conversations, but the marks of their hands remain. Then, after all that labor, some of these spaces are eventually filled. That fact follows us everywhere. Every time you imagine a pillar being quarried, remember that somebody later helped bury it. Every time you imagine people struggling to raise a stone, remember that another generation allowed earth and rubble to rise around it. It sounds contradictory only if we assume monuments are supposed to last forever in visible form. Maybe the builders did not think that way. Perhaps completion did not mean eternal display. Perhaps a structure could have a life. It could be born, used, altered, grow old, and eventually die. If so, burial might not have been destruction. It might have been the final stage of architecture, the last thing you do to the building. You quarry the stone, you shape it, you raise it, you gather around it. You use it for generations. And when its time is finished, you return it to the earth. The idea is impossible to prove from poetry alone. Later, we will look closely at the physical evidence for the fill and what archaeologists can actually say about it. For now, simply stand in the enclosure a little longer. The sun has climbed above the wall. Light reaches one of the central pillars. First the upper edge, then the blank head, then the carved arms, then the hands. For the people who made it, none of this is mysterious. That is perhaps the strangest thought of all. They know what the pillars mean. They know why there are two in the center. They recognize the animals. They understand the gestures. They know what should happen inside this circle and what should never happen here. The mystery belongs entirely to us. Time has taken the explanation and left the object. And on the next part of our slow walk through Göbekli Tepe, we will turn toward the creatures covering those objects. The foxes, the boars, the birds, the scorpions, and the snakes that still crawl across limestone after more than 11,000 years. Because whatever language the builders spoke has disappeared, but they left another kind of language behind. They carved it in animals. Now we move from the weight of the stones to the creatures that live upon them. At first, the limestone seems quiet. Stand a little closer, however, and the hill begins to fill with animals. A fox stretches across one pillar. On another, the heavy shape of a wild boar presses forward. Snakes twist through the stone in long, narrow lines. Birds appear with extended necks and sharp beaks. Elsewhere, there are creatures that seem smaller but no less unsettling. Scorpions, insects, animals with claws, teeth, wings and tails. It is a strange collection. There are no peaceful herds grazing beneath carefully carved trees. No comfortable scenes of family life. No houses, no fields, no smiling hunters returning with dinner. The stone world of Göbekli Tepe is crowded instead with wild things, and that may tell us something. The people gathering here live much closer to wild animals than most people do today. For them, an animal is not something encountered occasionally in a documentary or behind a fence. Animals determine where you walk, what you eat, what you fear, what you listen for after dark. The movement of animals can even tell you what season has arrived. Gazelle pass through the landscape according to patterns people learn over generations. Birds appear and disappear. Predators follow prey. Snakes become active when the weather changes. A person who cannot read these movements is at a disadvantage. A person who understands them can survive. So perhaps we should not be surprised that animals dominate the carvings. What is surprising is which animals receive attention. Many of the creatures represented on the pillars are not simply the most useful foods. Some are dangerous, some are scavengers, some are creatures you would rather discover from a distance. This has encouraged archaeologists to wonder whether the carvings belong to something more complicated than a simple catalogue of local wildlife. Perhaps they are symbols. That word is useful but dangerous. The moment we call something a symbol, we want to translate it. Fox means cleverness. Snake means rebirth. Vulture means death. Scorpion means danger. And very quickly we have created a neat, prehistoric dictionary that the builders themselves never gave us. So we have to resist. A fox means whatever a fox meant to them, and we do not know what that was. It may have meant several things at once. Imagine a hunter watching a fox at the edge of camp. The animal is small compared with the great wild cattle of the region. It cannot feed an entire gathering. Yet it survives through alertness and speed. It appears at strange hours. It steals. It watches. Its fur has value. Its behavior is familiar. Perhaps a particular family tells a story about a fox. Perhaps another group considers it an ancestor. Perhaps foxes are connected to a season. Perhaps the animal has a role in a story about death, hunting, marriage, or the origin of fire, or perhaps people simply admire foxes. 11,000 years later, all those possibilities look equally silent. The same problem follows the snakes. Snakes appear repeatedly at Göbekli Tepe, sometimes several seem to move together across a surface. Their bodies are ideal for carving. A few lines can create motion, but snakes are also difficult animals for humans to ignore. They appear suddenly, they disappear into cracks. Some are dangerous, they move without visible legs, they shed their skins. It is easy for a modern person to build mythology around those qualities. Many later cultures did, but later mythology is not a translation key for Göbekli Tepe. We cannot borrow the meaning of a snake from ancient Egypt, Greece, medieval Europe, or a village in India and carry it backward thousands of years. These builders belong to their own world. Their snake is their snake. Their fox is their fox. Their vulture is their vulture. And the vultures are particularly interesting. Large scavenging birds would have been familiar in the landscape. Where there is a carcass, vultures eventually arrive, they circle above death, they descend. They consume flesh. To people living outdoors and observing animals carefully, that connection would have been impossible to miss. This becomes especially intriguing because death may have been treated very differently in early Neolithic communities than it usually is in modern Western societies. In some prehistoric communities of the wider region, human remains were not always buried once and then left untouched forever. Bodies could be revisited, skulls could be removed, bones could be handled. The relationship between living people and human remains could continue long after biological death. At Göbekli Tepe itself, human bone fragments have added to discussions about mortuary practices, although the evidence remains incomplete. And so when a bird associated with carcasses appears in a symbolic setting, researchers naturally become curious. Could vultures have been connected to death rituals? Possibly. But possibly is not, certainly. That distinction will matter throughout our journey. There is one particularly famous group of imagery that has encouraged many interpretations. A pillar carries several figures together: a bird, other animals, abstract signs, and a small human-like figure that appears unusual and disturbing. Researchers have tried to understand whether such combinations form scenes rather than independent decorations. If they do, we may be looking at fragments of stories, but imagine finding a single illustrated page from a book whose language you cannot read. You recognize a bird. You recognize a person. You recognize a shape. That does not mean you know the plot. This is roughly the problem we face here. The builders may have understood the combination immediately. A child raised in their community might have pointed at the carvings and known the story. We are the ignorant ones. We stand in front of the same image thousands of years later and say, very thoughtfully, that it appears to be a bird. Still, patterns matter. Archaeologists compare which animals appear on which pillars. They examine orientation. They look at whether carvings face inward or outward. They ask whether certain animals repeatedly occur together. They compare one enclosure with another, and gradually the decoration begins to look less random. Different enclosures emphasize different creatures. This raises another possibility. Perhaps the animals identify groups of people. Human societies have often used animals to represent communities, families, lineages, or social categories. A group can become associated with a bird, another with a predator, another with a particular creature important to its territory or stories. If something similar happened here, then entering an enclosure might have meant entering a landscape of identities. The animals would not simply decorate the pillars. They would tell you who belongs, who built, who remembers. Perhaps a fox carved prominently on one stone announces the presence of a particular lineage. Perhaps a boar belongs to another. Then again, perhaps not. The evidence cannot carry us that far with confidence, but the possibility becomes especially interesting when we remember that Göbekli Tepe may have brought different communities together. A shared gathering place needs ways of expressing difference as well as unity. You come from your valley, I come from mine. Your people tell one story, mine tell another. But both of us enter the same enclosure. Both of us feast beneath the same sky. Both of us help move the same stone. The monument becomes a place where separate identities can exist inside a larger shared system. And perhaps that is why the carvings are so crowded. The stone has many voices because the gathering has many people. There are also abstract signs. These are quieter than the animals, but perhaps even more mysterious. Repeated geometric forms appear across the site. Some resemble the letter H to modern eyes. Others look like crescents, circles, or combinations of lines. Again, our modern descriptions are merely convenient labels. The builders did not think there is an H. The alphabet implied by that description lies unimaginably far in the future. For them, the shape had its own meaning, or perhaps several meanings. Could these marks be an early form of writing? That depends on what we mean by writing. There is no clear evidence that Göbekli Tepe contains a writing system comparable to later scripts, where signs consistently represent sounds, words, or grammatical information. Calling the carvings writing would therefore go too far. But communication does not begin with writing. A repeated image can carry shared information without recording spoken language. A mark can identify a group. A symbol can remind people of a story. An arrangement can indicate rank, season, direction, or ritual sequence. Think of a road sign. You do not need a sentence to understand that something is being communicated. Now remove the road. Remove the alphabet. Remove the modern world. The basic principle remains. A community that repeatedly uses the same visual forms can create a symbolic vocabulary without creating full writing. Perhaps something like that is happening on the hill. If so, the pillars are not simply art, they are memory. A story told aloud can disappear when the storyteller dies. A carved image lasts. Someone points at the fox and begins speaking. Someone touches the carved bird and remembers a name. Children learn what the symbols mean because older people explain them. Then those children grow old. They explain them to someone else. The pillar becomes a device for keeping memory stable. Not perfectly stable. Human memory never is. But more stable than words alone. This might explain why so much effort goes into carving durable stone. The builders are creating objects that outlive individuals. And this changes the emotional atmosphere of the enclosure. Imagine returning after many years. You are older now. Perhaps the first time you entered, you stood beside your mother. She is dead. But the fox she showed you is still there. Your fingers follow the same carved line hers once touched. The stone connects moments that human bodies cannot. This is ancestry made physical. Not far from lands where countless later peoples will live, trade, fight, marry, and disappear. These early communities are already confronting the same basic problem every human generation confronts. How do we remember people who are gone? How do we keep stories from vanishing? How do we tell children that they belong to something older than themselves? Stone is one answer, and Göbekli Tepe uses a great deal of it. But there is another possibility hiding among the animals. Perhaps the carvings do not only look backward, perhaps they help organize the year. For hunter-gatherers, animal behavior can function like a calendar. The arrival of certain birds signals a seasonal change. The movement of herds tells hunters when to gather. The appearance of plants, insects, and animals creates a sequence of ecological events. Spring does not arrive because a printed calendar says so. Spring arrives because particular things begin happening. A certain plant flowers, a certain bird returns, a herd moves, the nights change. If the gatherings at Göbekli Tepe happen seasonally, the animals carved there might be connected to those rhythms. A fox may belong to one period, a bird to another. A combination of creatures might remind people when a particular gathering should happen. This remains speculative, but it fits the wider reality of people whose survival depends on reading seasonal change with extraordinary care. There have even been attempts to interpret some of Göbekli Tepe's imagery in astronomical terms. Perhaps certain symbols represent stars, perhaps animal combinations encode events in the sky. These ideas are fascinating. They are also debated. And this is a good place to remember the rule we established when we first arrived on the hill. Evidence first, interpretation second. The evidence tells us animals and abstract signs were deliberately carved. The evidence tells us some motifs repeat. The evidence tells us their placement mattered enough for people to invest considerable labor in creating them. The exact message is where certainty ends. That uncertainty does not make the site less interesting. It makes it more human. People rarely live inside one simple explanation. A carving can be beautiful and sacred, practical and symbolic, a family emblem and a mythological figure, a reminder of hunting and a reminder of death. Modern categories like art, religion, economics, politics, and science may not divide this prehistoric world very cleanly. Perhaps nobody entering the enclosure would understand the question, is this religious or practical? To them, the answer might simply be yes. And so the animals remain. Foxes run forever without reaching the edge of the stone. Boars stand permanently alert. Snakes continue their silent movement. Birds wait above scenes whose stories have vanished. Scorpions never sting. The carved world is alive and completely still. But hidden among all these animals is something rarer. The human body, not merely the enormous human-like T-shaped pillars, but fragments and representations that draw us toward a darker question. What happened when someone died? Because if Göbekli Tepe was a place where scattered communities gathered to remember who they were, then the dead may never have been very far away. We drift onward, deeper into the forgotten days. The fires will be lit again. Animals will be butchered. Food will be shared. People who have traveled across the landscape will enter the circles together. And somewhere between the feast and the faceless pillars, we may begin to understand why a hill of stone could become important enough to unite people who had never built a city. Before, many generations later, their descendants decided that the time had come to cover it all with earth. Let us leave the carved animals in their limestone silence and follow the smell of smoke. Somewhere beyond the enclosure, meat is roasting. The hill is no longer quiet. People have arrived from different directions, and for a little while, Göbekli Tepe becomes something very different from the lonely archaeological ruin we know today. It becomes crowded, alive, noisy. Imagine approaching near the end of a long journey. You have been walking since morning. Dust covers your feet. A bundle presses against your shoulder. The people traveling beside you are tired enough that conversation has faded into occasional remarks. Then you reach higher ground. Smoke appears first. Several thin columns rise against the evening sky. After that comes the smell. Wood fire. Fat dripping onto hot stone. Roasted meat. Perhaps crushed grain being prepared nearby, and then the voices. Many more voices than you normally hear at home. For much of the year, your social world may consist of a relatively small community. You recognize every voice. You know every habit. You know who wakes early, who complains about the cold, who is generous with food, and who somehow manages to disappear whenever unpleasant work needs doing. Here, things are different. There are strangers. There are relatives you have not seen for a season. There are people whose speech sounds slightly unusual. There are children who have grown since the last gathering. There are old people missing from familiar groups, their absence quietly telling you what happened during the months apart. Perhaps there are new babies. Perhaps there are new marriages. Perhaps two people who were arguing the last time everyone gathered are still carefully avoiding each other. Human communities change between meetings. A place like Göbekli Tepe allows everyone to notice. Archaeologists cannot reconstruct one particular gathering in this kind of detail. What they can recover are traces, animal bones, stone tools, grinding equipment, architecture, debris created by people eating, working, and moving through the site. Those traces have encouraged researchers to consider feasting an important part of life around the hill. And feasting matters because feeding a crowd is difficult. A large gathering consumes food with astonishing speed. Even in the modern world, where ingredients can arrive from distant farms and food can be stored with ease, preparing a celebration for many people requires planning. Now remove refrigeration, remove supermarkets, remove metal cooking pots, remove trucks. Remove permanent fields producing predictable harvests on an industrial scale. The problem becomes much more interesting. Meat has to come from animals, and many of those animals are wild. Gazelle are especially prominent among the remains recovered at Göbekli Tepe. There are also wild boar, wild sheep, and other animals from the surrounding landscape. Imagine a hunting party leaving before dawn. They know the routes, they know the terrain, They know where animals tend to move. The hunters do not simply wander across the plain hoping dinner eventually appears. Successful hunting requires knowledge. Tracks in soft soil tell a story. Broken vegetation tells another. Droppings reveal how recently animals passed. Wind direction matters. Noise matters. The behavior of birds may matter. The hunters spread out. Perhaps some drive animals toward others. Perhaps natural features of the landscape help funnel movement. Then there is sudden speed, shouting, running, projectiles released, dust, confusion, an animal falls. For the hunters, success is only the beginning. A carcass is heavy, it has to be processed. Useful meat must be separated. Bones are broken or discarded depending on what people need. Hide may be valuable. Tendons can become useful material. Nothing about the animal is abstract. Every part requires work. Back at the gathering place, the result becomes social. Meat is distributed. Who receives which portion? Who eats first? Who provided the animal? Who prepared it? Does the successful hunter receive special recognition? Does the host group provide more food than the visitors? These questions sound ordinary. They are also political. A feast creates relationships. Suppose your group has had a good season. Hunting has gone well. Wild plants have been abundant. You arrive at the hill with enough food to be generous. You feed visitors. Everyone remembers. Months later, your own community experiences difficulty. Perhaps animals have moved elsewhere. Perhaps a useful patch of plants has failed. Now generosity can travel back toward you. The feast becomes a form of social insurance. You feed people when you can. They remember when you cannot. There does not need to be a written contract. Memory is enough. Reputation is enough. Kinship is enough. And in a world without government granaries or formal welfare systems, relationships can keep people alive. This is one reason gatherings among mobile or partly mobile communities can be so important. The hill is not merely a place for ceremony, it may also be where the social network is repaired. You learn who has food, who needs help, who is moving where, which spring is drying, where animals were last seen, which family has lost someone, which group has welcomed a child who is looking for a marriage partner, and who should probably not be seated beside whom at the feast. Stone monuments can appear solemn in museums. Human gatherings rarely are. There is another sound around the fires, laughter. Children chase each other. Someone tells a story everyone has heard many times and still insists on telling again. An older relative corrects details. Someone eats too much. Someone drinks something fermented. Perhaps, if interpretations of large stone vessels and cereal processing at sites in the region are correct, the possibility of prehistoric brewing around large gatherings has attracted considerable attention. Cereal grains can ferment. People do not need modern brewing equipment to discover that a wet mixture left under suitable conditions changes. Whether particular vessels at Göbekli Tepe were definitely used for beer remains debated. But the broader idea is plausible enough to keep researchers interested. And if fermented drink was present, the gathering becomes even more familiar. Food, drink, stories, ritual, people making promises they may feel differently about the next morning. Still, we should not turn Göbekli Tepe into a prehistoric festival simply because the image is entertaining. The architecture tells us that something more formal is happening. People are not gathering only because they enjoy company. The monumental enclosures demand attention. At some point, perhaps as daylight fades, activity around the fires changes. People begin moving toward the stones. Maybe only some enter. Maybe everyone is allowed inside but stands according to age, family, or status. We cannot know. The entrance itself may matter. You cross a boundary. Outside are cooking fires, tools, voices, ordinary work. Inside are pillars. The atmosphere changes, because architecture makes it change. Two great central figures wait ahead. Smaller pillars surround them. Animals emerge from stone. If fire provides the light, the carvings move with every flame. Now imagine sound inside the enclosure. Stone reflects voices. A chant spoken by many people becomes larger than the individuals producing it. A drum, if one is used, would be felt as much as heard. Feet striking the ground create rhythm. A storyteller's voice rises and falls. Perhaps everyone knows when to answer. Perhaps there are words only one specialist is permitted to speak. We cannot reconstruct the ceremony. But organized ritual does not require a palace or a written priesthood. Every human community has rules for important moments. There is a correct way to bury someone, a correct way to arrange a marriage, a correct way to welcome a visitor, a correct way to begin a hunt. The rules differ from culture to culture, but the existence of rules is nearly universal. Göbekli Tepe may preserve architecture designed around such rules, and somebody has to remember them. This gives us another kind of specialist, not a king. Not necessarily a priest in the later sense, perhaps an elder, a healer, a keeper of stories, someone who knows which animal belongs to which tale, someone who remembers the sequence of a ceremony, someone who can look at the sky, the movement of herds, and the state of plants, and say that the gathering should happen now. Knowledge creates authority. You listen because this person remembers. And memory is particularly valuable in a society without writing. Imagine carrying hundreds of names, relationships, stories, roots, seasons, rules, and obligations entirely inside human minds. There is no archive. If knowledge disappears from living memory, it may disappear completely. So communities develop methods to preserve it. Repetition, song, story, ritual, places, images. Perhaps the carvings of Göbekli Tepe participate in this system. A fox reminds the storyteller where to begin. A bird introduces another episode. A symbol marks a transition. The pillar becomes a stone prompt for a story that lives in human speech. Every gathering repeats it. Children hear it. Then one year, a child is old enough to recite part of it. Decades later, that child is the old person correcting everyone else. This is how memory becomes tradition. And tradition can coordinate people who do not live together. If your group and another group share the same sacred story, you have something in common even after months apart. If both groups recognize the authority of the same gathering place, disputes can be negotiated there. If everyone accepts that certain ceremonies must occur beneath the same pillars, the monument becomes neutral ground, or at least shared ground. That is an extraordinary social function. Before cities, before states, before written laws, a hill can help hold a network together. Perhaps this is why so much labor becomes possible. We often ask how hunter-gatherers could be persuaded to move enormous stones. But persuaded may be the wrong word. If the monument belongs to your ancestors, your stories, your marriage network, your hunting alliances, and your understanding of the world, working on it may not feel like labor imposed from above. It may feel like participation. Your family helped with the previous enclosure. Now it is your turn. A pillar needs moving. People gather. The work itself becomes an event. Food accompanies it. Songs coordinate pulling. Success becomes a story. Years later, someone points toward the standing stone and says they were there when it was raised. A younger listener has heard this story before, probably many times. Still, the pillar is proof. Grandfather may exaggerate everything else. But the stone really is standing. This creates another kind of ancestry, not ancestry written in family trees, ancestry written in work. Your people moved that, your people carved this, your people feasted here. And once generations begin investing identity into a place, abandoning it becomes difficult. Burying it becomes even stranger. Because filling an enclosure is not only covering stone, it is covering memory. Perhaps that is why the process appears to have been deliberate. If the monument had become meaningless, people could simply walk away. Wind and rain would eventually do the rest. Instead, human hands participated in its disappearance. That suggests the relationship had not become indifferent. Something that no longer matters rarely requires a carefully managed ending. Think about an ordinary campsite. When a seasonal camp is no longer useful, people leave, the fire dies, organic material decays. Wind scatters what remains. No generation returns with tons of rubble, merely to make certain the old fire pit can never be used again. Göbekli Tepe receives different treatment. Its monumental spaces are closed. And that may tell us that the hill remained socially powerful even when its original function was changing. perhaps too powerful to abandon casually. For now, however, the enclosures are still open. The feast continues. The fire has burned down into red coals. People sit close together as the night cools. Above them is a sky with almost no artificial light anywhere on Earth. Stars crowd the darkness. The Milky Way stretches across the heavens with a clarity difficult to imagine from modern London or any bright city. Someone points upward. Perhaps a story follows. Nearby, the pillars wait. A carved fox catches the last orange light from the fire. Children begin falling asleep. Visitors settle beneath hides or woven coverings. The conversations become softer. Tomorrow there may be another hunt. More food to process. More stone to move. More alliances to renew. But not everyone who came to this hill is present in the same way. Some are remembered. Some have died since the previous gathering. Some may be present only through stories, through bones, through names, or through objects carried by the living. And that leads us toward the quieter, darker edge of the hill's meaning. Because the people of this early Neolithic world do not necessarily treat death as a single moment, followed by permanent separation. Across the wider region, the dead can remain socially active in unsettling ways. Skulls can be removed. Bones can be handled. Ancestors can remain physically close to the living. And at Göbekli Tepe, fragments of human remains force us to wonder whether the faceless beings standing at the center of the circles were watching gatherings of more than just the living. Perhaps the feast was also a reunion with the dead. Let us stay beside the dying fire a little longer. The laughter has faded now. Most of the people who gathered for the feast are asleep. Beyond the glow of the coals, the hill dissolves into darkness. The pillars are only silhouettes against a sky crowded with stars, and somewhere in that darkness are the dead, not necessarily buried beneath neat stones, not necessarily lying in a cemetery. In this early world, death does not always create the clean boundary between the living and the dead that many modern people expect. Sometimes the relationship continues. To understand why this matters at Göbekli Tepe, we have to travel beyond the hill for a moment and look across the wider Neolithic world of Anatolia and the Levant. Archaeologists working at early settlements in these regions have discovered something peculiar. Human skulls sometimes receive special treatment. A person dies, the body is buried, but later the grave may be opened again. The skull is removed. At some sites, skulls are kept. At others, they are modified. In later Neolithic traditions, some are covered with plaster, creating modeled faces over the bone. Features can be carefully shaped, eyes may be represented. The dead person, whose flesh has disappeared, is given a face again. The practice is strange to us partly because modern burial traditions in many cultures emphasize leaving the body undisturbed. But there is nothing universal about that rule. Human societies have found countless ways to live with death. Some burn bodies, some bury them, some expose them, some preserve them, some move bones after decomposition, some keep parts of the dead close to the living. The people of the early Neolithic world have their own answers, and those answers sometimes involve the skull. Why, we do not know with certainty. Perhaps the head is associated with identity. It contains the face, the eyes, the mouth that once spoke, the features by which relatives recognized someone. If you wanted to preserve a physical connection to an ancestor, the skull would carry an obvious emotional power, but there could be other meanings. Skulls might represent enemies rather than beloved ancestors. They might demonstrate status. They might belong to ritual specialists. They might be used during ceremonies and later returned to burial. Different communities may have practiced similar-looking customs for completely different reasons. At Göbekli Tepe, the evidence is tantalizing but incomplete. Fragments of human bone have been recovered. Among them are pieces of skull. Some show deliberate modifications. Cut marks on certain fragments suggest that human hands worked on the bone after death. Researchers have also identified unusual features on some pieces, including incisions and, in at least one case discussed by archaeologists, a perforation that may have allowed a skull fragment to be suspended. That is a remarkable detail. But we should not allow one remarkable detail to become an entire imaginary ceremony. We do not have a surviving witness. We do not have a written explanation. We do not have rows of complete skulls hanging neatly from the pillars exactly as a dramatic reconstruction might show. We have fragments, marks, context, possibility. Still, the possibility changes the feeling of the hill. Imagine arriving at a gathering carrying something that belonged to a dead relative. Perhaps not a skull, perhaps a smaller object, a tool, a piece of clothing, a story. Maybe the person died during winter. Everyone at the gathering knew them. Now their absence must be acknowledged. Their relatives arrive without them. Someone asks what happened. The story is told, again and again. In a world without written notices or permanent records, death travels through conversation. By the end of the gathering, everyone knows. Perhaps a ritual marks the loss, perhaps the person's name is spoken beside the pillars. Perhaps nothing like this happened, but the architecture certainly gives people a place where memory can be shared. And shared memory is one of the ways ancestors are created. A dead person is not automatically an ancestor. An ancestor is someone the living continue to remember, someone whose identity remains useful. Your grandmother knew where water could be found during a dry season. Your grandfather helped establish an alliance with another group. A dead hunter knew a route through the hills. A respected elder remembered the correct words for a ceremony. When these people die, their practical presence disappears. But their social presence may continue. Stories preserve it. Objects preserve it. Places preserve it. And Göbekli Tepe is very good at preserving place. The great central pillars become especially interesting here. Remember their bodies, arms, hands, belts, garments, but no faces. If they represent human-like beings, they are not ordinary portraits. They do not seem to show the individual wrinkles, hair, expressions, or facial features of specific people. Instead, they are generalized, permanent, larger than life. Could they represent ancestors? Possibly. Could they represent supernatural beings? Also possibly. Could those categories overlap? Almost certainly. The modern distinction between an ancestor and a spirit may not have made sense to the people who stood here. A dead founder of a lineage might become something more than human in memory. A mythical being might also be described as an ancestor. Stories can fold human and supernatural worlds together. And the animals surrounding the pillars may participate in the same system. A vulture can be a real bird. It can also become connected with death. A fox can be hunted. It can also belong to a story. A snake can be dangerous. It can also represent something that only members of the community understand. This is why Göbekli Tepe resists simple labels. Calling it a temple sounds useful, but a temple, to many modern listeners, suggests a building dedicated mainly to religion, separated from ordinary economic and political life. Göbekli Tepe may not fit that division. Here, ritual can happen beside feasting. Feasting creates alliances. Alliances influence hunting. Hunting provides food for ritual. Marriage connects groups. Ancestors legitimize relationships. Stone architecture makes all of it permanent enough to survive between gatherings. Religion, politics, economics, family, and memory may be tangled together so tightly that separating them would distort the society we are trying to understand. Perhaps the hill is better imagined as a ceremonial center. Even that phrase remains imperfect, but it allows the place to perform several roles. People gather, people eat, people work, people remember, people negotiate. People encounter symbols that reinforce a shared understanding of the world. And perhaps they confront death. Imagine one ceremony, not because we know it happened exactly this way, but because the evidence allows us to understand the kinds of experiences the architecture could support. Night has arrived, people enter an enclosure. Torches or small fires provide uneven light. The central pillars rise above everyone. A ritual specialist stands near them. Someone carries a human bone. Perhaps it belonged to a relative, perhaps an important person, perhaps an enemy. We cannot know. The bone is shown, words are spoken. The surrounding people recognize those words. A story follows. Maybe the dead person's identity is connected to an older lineage. Maybe the story explains why a certain group has the right to hunt in a particular valley. Maybe it recalls a marriage that joined two communities. Maybe it has nothing to do with territory and everything to do with grief. A child watches. The child does not understand everything. Years later, the child will. That is how ritual works. It teaches before it explains. You repeat an action long before you become the person responsible for remembering why it matters. The next morning, ordinary life resumes. Bones from animals are discarded. Tools need sharpening. Someone has to fetch water. Children are hungry. The sacred does not eliminate the mundane, it sits beside it. This is another reason the archaeological deposits are so difficult to interpret. A bone can be dinner. A bone can be ritual. A broken tool can be rubbish. A broken tool can be an offering. The same object can change meaning depending on where it is placed and what people do with it. Thousands of years later, archaeologists see the final position. They do not see the gesture. And gestures matter. Consider a broken bowl from a much later village. If someone drops it accidentally, it becomes rubbish. If someone deliberately breaks it during a funeral, the fragments may look almost identical. The physical object alone does not contain the intention. Context helps, pattern helps, comparison helps, but intention is always the hardest thing to excavate. This becomes crucial when we return to the burial of Göbekli Tepe itself. Because the central mystery is not whether material entered the enclosures, it did. The question is what the action meant. If people already possess traditions in which human remains can be revisited, transformed, displayed, moved, or buried again, then perhaps they also understand buildings as things that can pass through stages. A structure might have something like a social life. It is created, it is used, it accumulates memories, it becomes old, then it is closed. That closure may require action, perhaps even ceremony. Think of the difference between abandoning a house and burying a person. When you abandon a house, you leave it behind. When you bury someone, you also leave them behind, but through an act that expresses continuing importance. You spend effort precisely because the relationship matters. Could Göbekli Tepe's enclosures have received something like architectural funerals? This is one of the more compelling ways to think about deliberate backfilling. Not as people trying to erase the past, but as people putting part of the past into its proper place. The distinction is enormous. To erase something, you might smash it, remove its symbols, reuse its stones, destroy its identity. At Göbekli Tepe, major pillars remain standing beneath the fill. Their bodies are covered rather than systematically obliterated. The stone figures are taken out of circulation. They become inaccessible, but they remain. That resembles burial more than vandalism. Of course, practical explanations remain possible. Old enclosures may have become unstable. Filling them could strengthen parts of the hill. Construction practices changed. New spaces may have required old spaces to be closed. The fill itself contains large amounts of debris that could have been convenient material. We should not imagine a solemn funeral merely because the idea feels poetic. Ancient people were perfectly capable of solving engineering problems without turning every shovel of dirt into a sacred gesture. But practical and symbolic explanations do not have to compete. A burial can be practical and meaningful. A house can be demolished for structural reasons while still receiving a closing ceremony. A field can be cleared for economic reasons while rituals mark the change. Human beings regularly attach meaning to necessary work. Perhaps the final filling of an enclosure feels something like that. The structure needs to close, everyone knows it. Its walls have changed, its social role has weakened. A new enclosure is being used elsewhere, so people gather. They bring rubble. They bring debris. Perhaps material from feasts, perhaps fragments associated with earlier activities. The first loads fall against the walls. The floor begins disappearing. A child who once played near the entrance watches adults carry baskets. An older person remembers when the enclosure was crowded. Earth rises around the smaller pillars. The carved animals vanish first. A snake disappears beneath stones, then a boar, then a fox. The central figures remain visible longer. Their lower bodies disappear. The belts vanish. Then the hands. Only the upper portions remain above the fill. For a while, perhaps the heads still stand over the new surface. Then more material arrives, and eventually they are gone. Imagine being the last person to see one of those pillars before it disappears. You know it is still there. Everyone knows the hill looks different now, but the stone has not left. That knowledge may matter. The enclosure has moved from visible space into remembered space. You cannot enter it anymore, but you can point toward the ground. There, underneath us, that is where the old pillars stand. Children born afterward may never see them. They know them through stories a generation later. The stories change. Another generation passes. Eventually, perhaps nobody remembers the exact location. The mound remains. Meaning fades. The stones sleep. This process may have happened repeatedly rather than in one dramatic final event. Different enclosures appear to have their own histories. Construction, modification, use, and filling can unfold across long periods. There may never have been a single day when everyone gathered and announced that Göbekli Tepe was finished forever. History rarely provides such clean endings. More often, a place dies room by room, a building closes, another remains active. One tradition disappears, another continues. People stop coming as often, repairs become less frequent, the younger generation prefers another gathering place. 1 year passes, then another, until what once seemed permanent becomes old. That may be the most ordinary thing about this extraordinary hill. The people who built Göbekli Tepe probably did not believe they were living at the beginning of civilization. They did not know archaeologists would someday give their period a name. They did not know that future humans would compare their monuments with Stonehenge or the pyramids. They were simply inheriting a world and changing it, just as every generation does. And eventually, some of what they inherited no longer fit. Perhaps the dead themselves helped explain why. An old enclosure belonged to old ancestors. A new community required new spaces. Closing the structure could honor those who came before, while freeing the living to move on. The past did not need to be destroyed. It needed to be placed somewhere safe. Beneath the earth was one possibility. So tonight, before we move deeper into the mystery of the backfill itself, imagine the hill after one enclosure has been sealed. The fires have gone out. Everyone has left. Wind passes over fresh soil. Nothing visible tells a traveler what lies underneath. Below the surface, the two central pillars remain upright. Their faceless heads are surrounded by darkness. The foxes are there. The snakes are there. The birds are there. No one sees them. No one touches them. But they have not been destroyed. They wait. And they will continue waiting through the birth of villages, through the rise of cities, through kingdoms and empires, through distant generations in York, London, Canterbury, Edinburgh, Flanders, Cornwall, and Normandy that cannot possibly know this buried hill exists. For more than 11,000 years, the stones will remain almost exactly where human hands left them, until another set of human hands begins removing the earth. And that is where our central question finally becomes unavoidable. How can archaeologists tell that this burial was deliberate? What is actually inside the fill, and what separates an intentional act performed by human beings from 11,000 years of ordinary dirt, rain, collapse, and wind? To answer that, we have to stop imagining for a moment. We have to look at the evidence. We drift onward now, away from the imagined ceremonies, and back toward the earth itself. Because dirt can tell a story. Not very quickly, not very clearly, and certainly not in a way that makes good conversation at dinner. But to an archaeologist, a layer of soil can sometimes reveal something that no carved animal ever could. It can reveal an action. At Göbekli Tepe, this matters enormously. If the great enclosures had simply been abandoned, then the mystery would be much smaller. People build things, people leave things. Roofs collapse, walls crumble. Wind carries dust into empty rooms. Rain moves soil downhill. Plants take root, animals burrow. Given enough time, almost any abandoned structure begins to disappear. 11,000 years is more than enough time. So when archaeologists first uncovered the great pillars beneath the hill, they had to ask an obvious question. Did nature bury them, or did people? The difference is everything. Imagine an enclosure left open on a windy hill. Nobody returns. The first year is uneventful. Leaves and dry grass gather against a wall. Rain washes a thin layer of soil into the lowest part of the floor. A small section of stonework loosens. Another winter arrives. Water enters cracks. Cold weather widens them. A few stones tumble. Plants establish themselves in the new sediment. Their roots push deeper. An animal digs a burrow. More dust arrives, decades pass, then centuries. If you excavated this place much later, you would expect the process to leave a particular kind of disorder. Fine sediments would accumulate gradually. Collapsed stones would often lie close to the walls they came from. Different natural episodes could create thin, irregular layers. A period of vegetation might leave organic material. A heavy rain might wash in a small deposit from somewhere nearby. The enclosure would slowly fill from the ordinary processes of weathering. Nature is patient. It does not usually arrive with baskets and finish the job before lunch. The deposits discovered inside important enclosures at Göbekli Tepe are different. The fill contains a mixture: limestone fragments, flint, animal bones, debris from human activity, material of different sizes mixed together, rather than looking simply like fine sediment that slowly drifted into an abandoned hollow. Much of it appears to have been brought into the structures through human activity. This is what archaeologists mean when they describe the deposits as anthropogenic, made or moved by people. And once you recognize that, the hill becomes stranger. Someone is putting material into these spaces, perhaps many someones, perhaps across multiple episodes. The distinction is important. The phrase "they buried Göbekli Tepe" can create an image that is almost too dramatic. You might imagine a single evening. A crowd gathers with baskets. A leader raises a hand. The final ceremony begins. Everyone spends the night filling the enclosures. By sunrise, an entire civilization has hidden its sanctuary. That makes a wonderful scene. The archaeology does not require it. The filling of different structures could have happened at different times. Some deposits may have accumulated through repeated episodes. Older buildings could be modified before finally being closed. The hill itself changed over generations. So rather than imagining one great burial, imagine a long history of closures. One enclosure becomes old. Another remains in use. A wall is altered. A floor is repaired. Material is dumped into a space. Later, more is added. Eventually, the structure is sealed. Then the same kind of process happens elsewhere. The result over time is a mound. This is quieter than the dramatic version. It is also more interesting because repeated burials suggests a practice. People may not be responding to one sudden disaster. They may be making the same kind of decision again and again. To understand how archaeologists see this, we need one wonderfully boring word: stratigraphy. It sounds like something designed specifically to make sleepy listeners even sleepier, which makes it perfect for tonight. Stratigraphy is the study of layers. The basic idea is beautifully simple. If one undisturbed layer lies beneath another, the lower one is generally older. People live on a surface. They leave things behind. Something covers that surface. People create another layer. Over time, the ground becomes a stack of moments. An archaeologist excavating carefully does not simply dig downward looking for interesting objects. The relationships between layers are often more important than the objects themselves. A flint tool without context is a tool. A flint tool sealed beneath a particular floor can help date activity associated with that floor. A bone found loose on the surface tells one kind of story. A bone found inside a sealed deposit tells another. Context is the difference between finding a sentence and finding the page it came from. At Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists examine how fill meets walls, how deposits sit around pillars, which layers cut through earlier ones, which surfaces were exposed before later material covered them. They study texture, color, stone size, bone distribution, tiny changes in sediment that most visitors would walk across without noticing. A good excavation can move painfully slowly. A few centimeters of soil may represent a question that takes hours to answer. Brush, scrape, photograph, measure, record. Do not remove anything until you understand what it touches. Then remove it, and repeat. It is almost the opposite of treasure hunting. The treasure hunter wants the object. The archaeologist wants the relationship. This is especially useful inside the monumental enclosures. Some of the great pillars remain rooted in their original positions, while fill surrounds them. That matters. If the structures had simply collapsed catastrophically and then become covered naturally, we might expect a different arrangement of stone. Instead, major standing elements can remain in place, while material rises around them. Imagine filling a room without removing the furniture. A chair remains upright, a table remains where it stood. You bring in rubble until the seat disappears. Then the tabletop. Eventually the room becomes solid. Thousands of years later, someone removes the rubble and finds the furniture still arranged inside. That is roughly the strange logic confronting excavators here, except the furniture weighs several tons and has foxes carved into it. The contents of the fill are equally revealing. Animal bones appear in enormous quantities across the site. Many belong to wild species that people hunted and consumed. There are flint flakes, including waste produced when stone tools are made or sharpened. There are fragments of worked stone. There is rubble. This material looks connected to human activity around the site, and so one possibility is almost wonderfully practical. People need fill. Nearby, they have rubbish. Problem solved. Ancient communities are not obligated to use clean ceremonial soil simply because future documentaries would prefer a more dignified story. Debris is useful, broken stone is useful, bones are material, waste from tool production is material. If you need to fill a large enclosure, using what is already available nearby makes sense. But then a second question appears. Why fill the enclosure at all? Perhaps the building has become unstable. This possibility deserves more attention than mysterious explanations usually receive. Stone structures require maintenance, walls lean, floors wear, rainwater enters places where you do not want it. Ground shifts, a pillar that once stood perfectly may begin to tilt. And Göbekli Tepe is not constructed by immortal master builders using modern engineering standards. It is maintained by generations of people experimenting with monumental architecture at an extraordinarily early date. They learn, they alter, they repair, they make mistakes. A structure can reach the end of its useful life simply because maintaining it becomes more trouble than replacing it. Backfilling solves several practical problems. It stabilizes a hollow, it supports surrounding ground, it removes a dangerous depression. It can create a new surface if later activity is planned nearby. An old enclosure filled with rubble becomes far less troublesome than an empty pit surrounded by aging stonework. This explanation is satisfyingly ordinary. Perhaps almost too ordinary for a place as famous as Göbekli Tepe, but ordinary explanations deserve respect. The people living here have practical problems just as we do. A leaking roof remains annoying even if the building beneath it is sacred. Yet practicality alone does not explain every choice. Suppose an enclosure has become structurally inconvenient, the builders could potentially dismantle it, useful limestone could be reused, pillars could be toppled, carvings could be destroyed. Instead, some monumental elements remain standing as the space is filled. That does not prove a ritual burial, but it leaves room for one. Perhaps filling is both engineering and ceremony. Human beings are very good at doing practical things symbolically. Consider the closing of a grave. Soil has to go back into the hole for obvious practical reasons, but the act can also carry enormous emotional meaning. A handful of earth dropped onto a coffin is physically insignificant. Symbolically, it can be the most difficult moment of the funeral. The same action can be practical and sacred. Maybe filling an old enclosure works similarly. The structure needs to close. The community also needs to acknowledge that closure. Debris enters. Perhaps certain material is chosen. Perhaps a feast accompanies the work. Perhaps words are spoken, or perhaps the ritual is simply the filling itself. We cannot recover the emotion from the sediment, but we can ask whether the pattern resembles deliberate closure practices found elsewhere. Archaeologists sometimes use terms such as termination deposits or closure rituals when buildings or sacred spaces appear to receive special treatment at the end of their use. Doorways can be blocked, objects can be deliberately broken, floors can receive final deposits, buildings can be burned, structures can be covered. The exact behavior varies enormously across cultures. The underlying idea is simple. A building does not merely stop, it is ended. This is especially plausible when architecture has accumulated social meaning. Imagine an enclosure where important ceremonies have taken place for generations. People have eaten there, remembered the dead there, settled disputes there, perhaps marriages were recognized there. Perhaps children were introduced to stories there. The stones have become part of community memory. Then the building reaches the end of its active life. Walking away may feel wrong. Leaving the pillars exposed to collapse may feel worse. So the community closes the place, they fill it, and in doing so, they transform it. Yesterday it was a room, today it is an ancestor beneath the ground. There is something else about burial that deserves attention. Burial restricts access. Once the fill rises high enough, nobody can casually enter the enclosure. Nobody can touch the central pillars. Nobody can perform the old ceremony there without first removing enormous quantities of material. The space is no longer merely unused, it is unavailable. That distinction opens another set of possibilities. Perhaps the old rituals have become inappropriate. Perhaps authority has changed. Perhaps the group that once maintained the enclosure no longer exists in the same form. Perhaps competing communities might claim it. If the monument carries social power, leaving it open could allow someone else to use that power. Burying it solves the problem. Nobody gets the old stage, the pillars remain, but they cannot be easily recruited into a new story. This interpretation becomes especially interesting when we remember the broader transformation occurring around the hill. People are becoming more settled, cultivation is becoming more important, communities are investing more heavily in particular places, and when people invest in land, relationships change. A mobile group can sometimes avoid conflict by moving. A village cannot move its field. A family cannot easily abandon stored grain. A community dependent on a particular spring has a reason to defend access to it. Territory becomes sharper. Ownership becomes more consequential. And a shared ceremonial center that once brought scattered groups together might gradually become politically awkward. Who controls it? Who organizes the feast? Who speaks first? Whose ancestors are represented? Who has the right to repair a pillar? Who decides when an enclosure is closed? We have no written council records. No prehistoric clerk has kindly left us minutes from the meeting, so this remains interpretation, but social institutions can become obsolete for the same reason buildings do. The world around them changes. A monument created to unite mobile communities may become less useful when those communities live increasingly settled lives. The hill remains powerful precisely because it belongs to the older system. Perhaps burying it is a way of neutralizing that power without insulting it. Do not destroy the ancestors. Do not let anyone own them. Put them beneath the earth. There is another theory that sounds more dramatic. Conflict. Was Göbekli Tepe attacked? Was it buried to hide it from enemies? Did violence force people to close the site? At present, the evidence does not give us a clear story of a catastrophic assault ending the monumental complex. We should be cautious about imagining burning sanctuaries and desperate defenders simply because ancient violence makes exciting television. If a major destructive attack occurred, archaeologists might hope to find corresponding evidence. Widespread destruction, burn layers associated with catastrophe. Human remains showing particular patterns of trauma, weapons in relevant contexts, hasty defensive modifications. The archaeological picture is more complicated and less cinematic. That does not mean conflict never happened. Human beings living 11,000 years ago were still human beings. Disagreements existed, violence existed, competition existed, but the deliberate filling of enclosures does not require a dramatic invasion. The quieter possibilities may fit better. Social change, ritual change, architectural maintenance, a gradual shift away from older gathering patterns, or several of these at once. This is the frustrating beauty of Göbekli Tepe. The closer you move toward the answer, the more the answer divides. Why bury it? Because the buildings were old, because the rituals changed, because society changed, because people were settling, because the enclosures needed stabilization, because closing them had symbolic meaning, because leaving them open created problems. Perhaps, perhaps, perhaps. Archaeology rarely gives us the satisfaction of a confession. Nobody carved onto a pillar, we buried this place because instead we have dirt, mixed rubble, bones, flint, standing pillars surrounded by fill, layers resting against walls. And from those quiet materials, researchers build arguments. Some arguments become stronger, others weaken as excavation continues. New discoveries can change the picture, and much of Göbekli Tepe still remains beneath the ground. That point deserves to linger. The site we discuss so confidently is not fully excavated. There are still structures hidden inside the mound, still deposits untouched by modern hands, still evidence capable of changing interpretations we currently treat as reasonable. Perhaps somewhere beneath the hill is a context that will make one explanation much stronger. Perhaps not. Sometimes archaeology gives you another puzzle instead of an answer. For tonight, we can say something more modest. The great enclosures did not simply vanish beneath 11,000 years of careless dust. Human activity played a major role in filling them. People participated in the closing of these spaces. And that means the burial itself belongs to the history of Göbekli Tepe. It is not what happened after the story ended. It is part of the story. Perhaps even its final architectural act. The builders shaped the hill once by removing stone. Later communities shaped it again by putting material back. Creation and burial become two halves of the same long process, and beneath the growing mound, the pillars remain standing, not smashed. Not forgotten immediately, simply removed from sight. So now the question becomes narrower, not whether people helped bury Göbekli Tepe, but why deliberately closing an old sacred place might have made sense to them. To answer that, we have to look beyond engineering, beyond dirt, beyond even ritual. We have to imagine a world in which the old hill is becoming less useful, perhaps more contested, while villages, fields, and new forms of authority begin spreading through the landscape. A world where preserving the past might require making sure nobody can use it anymore. Now we move from the soil inside the enclosures to the people standing above it, because filling a monument is not simply an archaeological process. At some point, somebody has to decide that the old place should close, and decisions like that are rarely made in an empty world. The landscape around Göbekli Tepe is changing, slowly at first. So slowly that a single person might barely notice. A grandfather remembers when people traveled farther to hunt. A mother notices that her family spends more of the year near the same spring. A child grows up believing that tending useful plants near a settlement is perfectly ordinary, even though the child's great-grandparents may have lived differently. This is how enormous transformations often feel from inside them. Not enormous, normal. One season becomes another. One habit replaces another. And eventually a society is doing something its ancestors would have found strange. Agriculture is emerging across parts of the Fertile Crescent, not suddenly. There is no single morning when everyone wakes up, puts down a hunting spear, picks up a farming tool, and declares the Neolithic revolution complete. The transition unfolds across generations. People continue hunting, they continue gathering. But some wild plants receive more attention. Useful stands of cereal are revisited, seeds are collected, perhaps some are deliberately scattered, certain patches are protected. Over generations, plants themselves begin changing under human selection. Animals also enter new relationships with people. Wild herds remain important, but eventually in communities across the region, humans begin managing some species rather than merely pursuing them. That changes almost everything. Imagine the difference between hunting a wild animal and caring for a herd. A wild herd leaves, you follow it if you choose. A managed herd becomes an obligation. Animals need water. They need protection. They reproduce according to rhythms that shape your own schedule. A field creates the same problem. Once you have invested labor into planting, you cannot wander away for months without consequence. The land begins making demands. Stay, wait, protect, harvest, store, return. And so the human map shrinks, not necessarily in knowledge. People may still know distant valleys, they may still travel, but everyday life becomes increasingly rooted. A house is built, then repaired. Storage spaces appear. A family has more possessions than it can comfortably carry. A field lies nearby. Another family lives next door, then another. The village becomes a permanent fact, and permanent neighbors are useful. They are also exhausting. A mobile community can sometimes solve tension by separating. If two groups disagree badly enough, one can leave. When houses, fields, storage, and managed animals anchor people to the same place, walking away becomes expensive. Now, disagreements remain close. Who uses the spring first? Where does one family's field end? Who has access to the best grazing? Who owes labor to whom? Who marries whom? Who controls stored food? And who speaks for the ancestors? These questions are not unique to farmers, but settled life gives them sharper edges. This is where Göbekli Tepe may have become politically complicated. Imagine that the hill once belongs, in some sense, to everyone who gathers there. Different groups arrive, they bring food, they contribute labor, they recognize shared stories. No single family needs to live permanently beside the monument. The hill works because it stands between communities, a shared place, a central place. Perhaps even neutral ground. Then settlement increases. One community now lives closer than the others. Its members can reach the hill easily. They maintain structures more often. They provide more food for gatherings. They begin organizing ceremonies. At first, this may seem practical. Someone has to do the work, but practical advantages can become authority. The group that maintains the sanctuary may gradually claim the right to decide how it is used. The family providing the feast may expect recognition. The person who remembers the rituals may begin passing that role to a child. Prestige becomes inheritance, and suddenly the hill that once connected people can begin separating them. Who owns the old pillars? It sounds like a modern question. But ownership does not need a legal document. It can mean something much simpler. Who has the right to use them? Who can enter? Who decides when people gather? Who is allowed to alter the enclosure? Whose story explains the carved fox? Whose dead are remembered beneath the faceless stones? If several groups disagree, the monument becomes more than sacred architecture. It becomes power. This is why ritual and politics are so difficult to separate. The person who organizes a large feast demonstrates generosity. Generosity attracts followers. The person who settles disputes gains influence. The person who speaks for ancestors can make claims about tradition. And tradition can justify rights. We have no evidence that Göbekli Tepe produced kings. We should not imagine a prehistoric monarch sitting on a limestone throne. But inequality does not need a crown. Influence can begin quietly. One family has more connections. One hunter is unusually successful. One elder controls valuable knowledge. One group consistently provides the largest feast. People listen to them. Then their children expect to be heard as well. Perhaps the burial of an old enclosure helps prevent such power from becoming permanent. If nobody can use the space, nobody can control it. Fill the entrance, cover the floor. Bury the central pillars. The sacred authority remains in the earth, but its political usefulness disappears. No rival group can simply arrive next season and claim the old sanctuary. No ambitious ritual specialist can stand between the central pillars and announce that the ancestors now speak only through him. The stage itself has been removed. This idea is attractive. It is also speculative. We have to keep returning to that word, speculative. There is no inscription saying the enclosures were buried to prevent political competition. There is no surviving account of rival communities arguing over the hill. The theory grows from what we know about human societies and from the changing social world around the site. It is possible, it is not proven. Another possibility is less political and more spiritual. Perhaps the pillars themselves become dangerous. Not physically dangerous. Powerful. Many cultures treat sacred objects differently once they are no longer actively used. You do not necessarily throw them away. Their sacred character may make ordinary disposal impossible. A powerful object can remain powerful even when its original purpose has ended, sometimes especially then. Imagine that the central pillars represent beings connected to ancestors or supernatural forces. For generations, people maintain the correct relationship with them. They perform rituals, they bring offerings, they speak particular words. Then the social system changes. Fewer people know the rituals. The specialists who maintain them die. The community moves toward new practices. What do you do with the old sacred beings? Leaving them exposed may feel irresponsible. Destroying them may feel dangerous. Reusing the stone for a wall may be unthinkable. So you bury them. The earth becomes a boundary, a container. The old power is not denied, it is contained. There is something familiar in this even across enormous distances of time. Human beings often bury things they respect, bodies, relics, ceremonial objects. Even objects considered dangerous can be hidden rather than destroyed. Burial removes something from ordinary life without claiming that it has ceased to matter. Perhaps that is exactly what happens here. The enclosure has completed its work. The beings must sleep, so people place the old sacred world beneath the ground. Another theory returns us to architecture. Perhaps the entire mystery is partly created by our desire for a dramatic answer. Imagine an old enclosure. Its wall has begun failing, the floor is damaged, a pillar leans, a newer structure nearby needs a stable surface. The easiest solution is to fill the old one. People use rubble and accumulated debris because it is available. No great theological crisis is necessary. No political struggle, no environmental disaster, just prehistoric maintenance. This possibility sounds disappointingly ordinary until you remember that ordinary decisions shape history constantly. A medieval wall in York can disappear because someone needs building stone. A Roman structure can survive because later builders happen to use it as a foundation. An ancient monument can be preserved because covering it is easier than dismantling it. Accident and practicality are powerful forces. But again, practicality and symbolism can coexist. Perhaps the old enclosure needs filling. The community turns the necessary work into a ritual closure. That may be the most human answer of all. You have a practical problem, so you solve it in a meaningful way. There is also the possibility of changing ritual fashion. Yes, even prehistoric ritual can have fashion. Not fashion in the sense of clothing trends changing every season, but human preferences evolve. One generation builds circles, another prefers smaller structures. One generation emphasizes enormous pillars. Later communities integrate special buildings into settlements, symbols change, ceremonies move, stories are reinterpreted. What felt essential to grandparents can feel strangely old-fashioned to grandchildren. Imagine a young person living during the later phases of the hill. Older relatives speak reverently about the great enclosure. The young person respects it, but the rituals that matter most to their own life happen somewhere else. Perhaps in a building near a home, perhaps around a household, perhaps inside a village. The old hill remains important because ancestors built it, but importance is no longer the same as usefulness. That distinction can kill institutions. People continue respecting them after they stop needing them. Eventually, maintenance becomes harder to justify. Attendance falls. Knowledge fades. Then comes closure. There is no rebellion, no attack, no dramatic rejection. People simply move on. If that is what happened, the burial of Göbekli Tepe may record something surprisingly gentle, a tradition reaching its natural end, and then there is climate. The early Holocene world around the site is not environmentally static. The long, cold conditions associated with the end of the Ice Age give way to a generally warmer world. But climate does not move smoothly. Rainfall changes, vegetation shifts, animal populations respond, migration routes can change. A landscape that supported one pattern of seasonal gathering may become better suited to another. For hunter-gatherers, these changes are not statistics. They are dinner. A herd arrives later than expected. A spring produces less water. A stand of wild grain becomes unreliable. A familiar route is no longer worth the journey. Small environmental changes can reshape a social calendar. Suppose gatherings at Göbekli Tepe depend partly on seasonal abundance. People arrive when gazelle are plentiful. Large hunts support feasts. Wild plant foods are available. Now imagine those conditions becoming less predictable. The gathering becomes more expensive. People have to bring food from farther away. Fewer groups attend. Meanwhile, cultivated resources near settlements become more reliable. The economic logic shifts. Why travel to the old hill for a massive feast when smaller ceremonies can happen near stored grain and managed resources? No single drought needs to destroy Göbekli Tepe. The monument can decline through inconvenience. That sounds almost insulting to something so magnificent. But inconvenience has ended many traditions. The journey becomes too difficult. The repair becomes too expensive. The younger generation lives elsewhere. The calendar changes. Then one year, the gathering does not happen. Perhaps the next year it does. Then another gap. Slowly, the old rhythm breaks. This is why searching for one cause may be the wrong approach. Why was Göbekli Tepe buried? Perhaps because the buildings were aging, because society was settling, because rituals were moving into villages, because environmental patterns were changing, because the old spaces carried sacred power, because filling them solved engineering problems, because burying them prevented inappropriate reuse, because the community wanted closure. All of those can be true at once. History likes single causes, because single causes make clean stories. Human life is rarely clean. Imagine your own family leaving a house occupied for generations. Why do you leave? Because repairs cost too much. Because work has moved elsewhere. Because the family is smaller. Because another house is more convenient. Because memories make the old place difficult. Because somebody died. Which reason is the reason? All of them. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe deserves the same generosity. The people who filled these enclosures may not have shared one motive. Different generations may have understood the act differently. One worker thinks about stability, another thinks about ancestors. Another simply carries rubble because everyone else is carrying rubble, and lunch will be served when the work is finished. The old ritual specialist whispers words. A child is bored, someone's back hurts. Someone else remembers a feast held here many seasons ago, and slowly the earth rises. This is what grand historical transitions look like from close enough, not diagrams, people, one basket at a time. The central pillars disappear beneath the fill. Perhaps an older person watches until the final visible edge is covered. The younger people may never enter that enclosure again. They return home, they tend plants, they repair houses, they manage animals. They raise children who know the old hill mostly through stories. And the center of human life continues moving away from seasonal gathering places and toward permanent settlements. The monument has not been destroyed, it has been retired, placed beneath the earth at the moment when the world that created it is becoming something else. There is a quiet irony here. If people had left the enclosures exposed, weather and later human activity might have damaged them far more severely. If later generations had reused the pillars as convenient building stone, much of the monument could have vanished. If enemies had deliberately smashed everything, we would have inherited fragments. Instead, burial protected the stones. The act that made Göbekli Tepe disappear also helped it survive. For thousands of years, rain falls above it. People walk across the mound. Empires rise far away. The pyramids are built. Stonehenge is raised. Cities grow. Ships cross seas. Rome appears and disappears. Medieval bells eventually ring across Canterbury and York. Generations live in Cornwall, Edinburgh, Flanders, London, and Normandy. None of this matters to the pillars. They remain underground. The fox remains beside the same stone body. The snake never moves. The carved hands rest forever against the limestone. And eventually, in a world the builders could never have imagined, archaeologists uncover them again. Not because the ancient people failed to bury the site, but because they succeeded. That may be the strangest answer to the mystery. Why did they bury Göbekli Tepe? We cannot know exactly, but whatever their reason, the burial did not erase the monument. It carried it forward. The people who closed the enclosures removed them from their own present and accidentally preserved them for our future. And now we leave the filled circles beneath the earth for a little while. We drift outward across the surrounding plain, toward villages where grain is being tended more carefully. Houses are becoming more permanent, and animals are beginning to live under increasingly human control. Because the final part of our journey is not really about the death of Göbekli Tepe, it is about the birth of the world that came after it. Let us leave the buried pillars behind and walk down from the hill. The world below is changing, not with the noise of an army, not with the sudden arrival of a new king. There are no proclamations. No written laws announce that the old way of life has ended. Instead, somewhere in the landscape, someone is paying unusually close attention to grass. It does not sound like the beginning of a revolution, but it is. Across the Fertile Crescent, communities have gathered wild cereals for generations. Wheat and barley grow naturally in parts of this broad region. People know where to find them, when they ripen, and how to process them. Imagine a group arriving at a familiar patch of wild grain. The stalks move gently in the breeze. Hands cut them. Seeds are collected. Some fall onto the ground. The people leave. Months pass. Then they return. Perhaps they notice that grain grows particularly well near places they disturbed the previous year. Perhaps they begin removing competing plants. Perhaps they scatter seeds deliberately. No one needs to understand genetics. No one needs to know the word domestication. They only need to notice that certain actions produce more food. Then they repeat those actions again and again. Over generations, something extraordinary happens. The plants begin changing. Wild cereals naturally benefit when their seeds scatter easily. A ripe seed head breaks apart. Seeds fall. The plant reproduces. But this is inconvenient for humans. People prefer plants whose seeds remain attached long enough to be harvested. So when gatherers repeatedly collect the plants that hold their seeds most effectively, they accidentally favor particular characteristics. Human choice begins shaping evolution. The grain changes because people gather it, people change because they depend increasingly on the grain. Neither side of the relationship can easily return to what it was before. This process is slow enough that nobody experiences the entire transformation. A grandmother teaches a child how to harvest. The child later teaches another child. Each generation makes tiny adjustments. Eventually, the landscape contains plants that are increasingly dependent on human cultivation. And the people cultivating them are increasingly dependent on staying nearby. This is where the freedom of movement begins to narrow. A hunter can follow a herd. A gatherer can move toward ripening plants. But a farmer has made an appointment with the future. Seeds go into the ground. Now you wait. Rain matters. Weeds matter. Animals that eat young plants matter. Someone has to remain close enough to protect the investment. Then comes harvest, then processing, then storage. And stored food creates another problem. It is heavy. You cannot casually carry an entire season's grain across the landscape, so you build somewhere to keep it. Once you have storage, you need to protect the storage. Once you have a building, you repair the building. Once several families do this in the same place, paths become permanent, walls rise, floors are renewed, ash accumulates, children grow up knowing one doorway as home. The village begins to hold people in place. This does not mean hunting disappears. For a long time, communities combine different strategies. Wild animals remain important. Wild plants remain important. People experiment. Some years may reward cultivation. Other years remind everyone why hunting knowledge still matters. The transition is uneven, but the direction is increasingly clear. Humans are investing more labor into particular pieces of land, and land remembers labor. If your family cleared a patch, planted it, guarded it, and harvested it, you may begin feeling that your family has a special claim to it. If someone else arrives and harvests the grain, the disagreement is no longer about an abstract landscape. It is about months of work. Settlement, therefore, creates a new emotional geography. My house, our storage, your field, their grazing area. The spring everyone needs. The path between villages. These distinctions may have existed in other forms among mobile communities, but farming intensifies them. Now imagine how different this world feels from the one that created the earliest monumental enclosures at Göbekli Tepe. The old hill may have drawn groups from across a wider territory. People came together because they did not spend all year together. The gathering repaired relationships stretched across distance. But what happens when many of those relationships become local? Your cousin lives 2 houses away. Your marriage partner comes from a nearby settlement. Your neighbors help with harvest. You see the same people every morning. The village itself begins performing some of the social work once performed by the distant gathering place. You do not need to wait for a seasonal assembly to discuss every problem. The person you disagree with lives beside you. Unfortunately, you can argue today and tomorrow, and, if necessary, for the next several decades. This is civilization developing one of its most durable traditions, the permanent neighbor. Ritual changes as well, at sites elsewhere in the region. Communal and symbolically important spaces begin appearing within settlements. The sacred does not disappear. It moves closer to daily life. Instead of traveling to a monumental hill separated from ordinary domestic existence, people can participate in ceremonies near houses, storage rooms, courtyards, and workshops. The boundary between ritual and home shifts. This may help explain why Göbekli Tepe eventually loses its central role. The hill belongs to a social technology designed for people who need to gather. The village belongs to people who are already gathered. That is a profound difference. Think of the monumental enclosures as machines for creating community. Not machines with gears, social machines. You arrive separated, you feast together, you work together, you enter the same symbolic spaces, you hear the same stories, you leave connected. The monument remains behind, waiting for the next gathering. A village does this continuously. People wake near one another, they share water, exchange food, raise children, repair walls, borrow tools, argue over animals, attend deaths, arrange marriages, remember obligations. Community becomes daily rather than seasonal. The Great Hill is no longer the only anchor. Perhaps it is not even the most useful one. And as this happens, another transformation takes place. Labor changes. Building Göbekli Tepe requires bursts of cooperative effort. Many people can gather for a period, quarry stone, move pillars, feast, and then return to other parts of the landscape. Agriculture asks for a different rhythm, not spectacular labor, routine labor. Day after day, fields do not care that you would rather carve a fox. Grain needs processing, roofs need repair, food needs storage, animals need attention, water has to be carried, children still need feeding. The spectacular monument competes with 1,000 ordinary tasks. And ordinary tasks usually win because hunger is very persuasive. Imagine an elder proposing another great construction project on the hill. A new enclosure, a new pair of pillars. The idea once would have brought several communities together. Now people hesitate. One family needs to prepare fields. Another is repairing a house. Someone else has animals requiring attention. The journey takes time. The feast requires food. The stone requires weeks of labor. Perhaps the answer is not no, not yet. Maybe next season, then next season arrives. There are still other priorities. A tradition does not always end when people reject it. Sometimes it ends when people become too busy. That possibility feels almost painfully ordinary. The monumental age of the hill could fade partly because daily life has become more demanding elsewhere, and then climate adds its quiet pressure. The early Holocene brings broad environmental changes to Southwest Asia. The world is emerging from the colder conditions of the late Ice Age. Temperatures rise, vegetation changes, rainfall patterns shift. Some landscapes become richer, others experience instability. Animal populations respond. The people living through these centuries do not see a climate graph. They see grass, water, animals, a spring that used to last longer, a herd that arrives earlier, a patch of useful plants that has expanded or disappeared. Climate is experienced through small disappointments and unexpected abundance. Suppose the annual gathering at Göbekli Tepe has long coincided with the movement of gazelle. The timing is useful, many people gather. Hunters cooperate, meat becomes available for feasting. Then migration patterns shift. Not completely, just enough. The animals arrive at a different time, or pass through another part of the landscape. Now the old gathering calendar fits less comfortably. People can adapt. Humans are excellent at adapting. But every adaptation changes traditions slightly. Move the feast, change the season, use different animals, bring stored grain, hold the ceremony nearer the village. Each solution makes the old hill a little less essential. Meanwhile, farming offers something psychologically powerful. Predictability. Not perfect predictability. Early agriculture is risky. Crops fail. Weather disappoints. Stored grain attracts pests. Animals become sick. A settled population can suffer terribly when a harvest goes wrong. But cultivation allows people to influence food production more directly. Instead of waiting entirely for nature to provide food in the right place, humans begin arranging the landscape to provide food where they want it. That is an enormous shift in attitude. The wild landscape once tells you where to go. Now increasingly, you tell part of the landscape what to become. Clear this patch, plant here, keep these animals, store food there, build beside this spring. The world becomes organized around human investment. Göbekli Tepe belongs to the threshold of that change. Perhaps that is why the site feels so strange. It stands between worlds. Behind it stretches an almost unimaginable depth of human existence. in which hunting, gathering, mobility, and seasonal knowledge dominate. Ahead lies the increasingly settled Neolithic world: villages, domesticated plants, managed animals, stored surplus, property, more permanent social hierarchies, eventually towns, then cities. The people on the hill do not know they are standing between these worlds. No historical period ever feels like a historical period while you are brushing dust from your clothes and wondering what to eat. But from our distance, the transition becomes visible. And Göbekli Tepe may preserve a moment when monumental ritual helps hold communities together just before permanent settlement begins doing the same job differently. This also changes how we think about the old question of what came first. For generations, a simple model seemed persuasive. People develop agriculture. Agriculture creates surplus. Surplus allows some people to stop producing food full-time. Specialists appear. Priests appear. Large organized communities appear. Then those communities build monuments. Göbekli Tepe complicates that sequence. Here, substantial monumental construction appears extraordinarily early. That suggests shared ritual, social gathering, and organized labor are not merely luxuries produced after agriculture. They may be active forces in the transformation. People need food because they gather. Gatherings encourage cooperation. Cooperation creates monuments. Monuments encourage people to return. Returning repeatedly to one region makes local food resources more valuable. Cultivation helps support gatherings. Cultivation encourages settlement. Settlement changes the gatherings. The relationship becomes circular. There may never have been a single cause. Civilization is not a row of dominoes falling neatly in one direction. It is a web. Pull one strand and several others move. Perhaps the builders of Göbekli Tepe are experimenting not only with architecture, but with new ways of being together. They are discovering how strangers and distant relatives can cooperate on projects larger than one family. That skill will become enormously important later. A village requires cooperation. Irrigation will require cooperation. City walls will require cooperation. Temples, roads, armies, markets, and states will all depend on convincing large numbers of people to coordinate their behavior. Göbekli Tepe does not create those later institutions directly, but it shows that humans are capable of remarkable collective organization before many of those institutions exist. That is one reason the site changed archaeological thinking. The people here are not waiting passively for farming to make them socially complex. They already possess networks, ritual, specialized knowledge, planning, symbolism, collective labor. They are already doing complicated human things. Agriculture changes the scale and rhythm. It does not invent the human mind. And perhaps, after generations of this transition, the old hill begins to feel like a memory of another age. A respected memory, a powerful memory, but a memory nonetheless. Imagine an older person climbing the slope one final time. Below, permanent settlements are becoming more important. Smoke rises from places occupied for longer stretches of the year. The sounds of daily life cling to them. Grinding stone against grain. Animals, children, construction. The elder reaches the enclosure. Perhaps part of it has already been filled. Only the upper portions of certain pillars remain visible. They remember when the space was open, when people traveled from farther away, when fires covered the hill. When a particular relative, long dead now, stood beside one of the stones, the world has not ended. It has simply moved. This may be the quietest explanation for the burial. Göbekli Tepe does not necessarily die because something goes terribly wrong. Perhaps it dies because something else begins working better. The village, the field, the household, the local shrine. New ways of organizing memory and cooperation. The old ceremonial machinery is no longer required in quite the same form, so it is not smashed, it is placed beneath the earth. The younger generation goes home. The grain still needs grinding. And that evening, beneath a sky the ancient builders would recognize, the buried pillars begin another kind of existence, not as active monuments, as memory, as foundations, as stones waiting in darkness, while the human world above them moves toward farming, villages, cities, and eventually history itself. And now, only one part of our nighttime journey remains. We have watched the hill rise. We have entered its stone circles. We have followed foxes and vultures across the pillars. We have sat beside prehistoric feasts. We have imagined the dead. We have watched rubble rise around the faceless figures. But before we leave Göbekli Tepe sleeping beneath the earth, there is one final question. What did its discovery actually change? And after everything archaeologists have learned, how much of the mystery remains? We drift onward one final time, leaving the first fields and permanent villages behind, and climbing back toward the quiet hill. Göbekli Tepe is silent again. The fires are gone. The hunters are gone. The voices that once echoed between the pillars have disappeared so completely that we cannot recover a single word of their language. The people who quarried the limestone are dead. Their children are dead. Their descendants have moved into a different world. And slowly even the memory of the hill begins to fade. For generation after generation, the buried enclosures remain beneath the earth. Perhaps some people still remember them at first. An older person points toward the mound. There are stones underneath. There were gatherings there once, my grandfather told me. Then that older person dies. The story passes to someone else. It becomes shorter, less certain. Perhaps the next generation remembers only that the hill is old. Another generation remembers nothing at all. This is how places disappear without moving. The stone remains exactly where it was, only the meaning leaves. Grass grows, rain falls. Animals cross the slope. People continue living nearby. Children climb the hill without knowing what lies beneath their feet. Someone may sit on the ground directly above a buried enclosure and eat a meal. Someone else may sleep there. A shepherd, many thousands of years later, may watch animals graze across the mound. The pillars remain below, human-shaped, faceless, patient, and above them history begins, not because history itself suddenly starts, of course. Human beings have already lived stories for countless generations, but writing eventually appears elsewhere. Names begin surviving. Kings leave inscriptions. Merchants record quantities. Officials record taxes. Wars acquire dates. Cities acquire archives. The human past becomes increasingly noisy. Göbekli Tepe remains silent. Far to the south, the first great urban civilizations develop in Mesopotamia. Settlements become towns. Towns become cities. Temples rise above crowded streets, administrators count grain, scribes press signs into clay. Human beings begin leaving messages that future archaeologists can actually read. The contrast is almost cruel at Göbekli Tepe. We would give almost anything for one sentence, one name, one explanation. Instead, the hill gives us foxes, snakes, boars, birds. Hands carved onto limestone, enough to prove that meaning existed. Not enough to tell us exactly what the meaning was. Then Egypt rises. Pharaohs rule beside the Nile. Pyramids appear. By the time those enormous monuments are being constructed, the oldest activity at Göbekli Tepe already belongs to a past several thousand years deep. Think about that for a moment. To the people building the pyramids, the earliest monumental phases at Göbekli Tepe would already have been ancient. Not merely old, ancient. If an Egyptian traveler could somehow have reached the hill and known what lay underneath, that traveler would have been looking backward across an enormous gulf of time. But nobody knows. The mound keeps its secret. Later still, Stonehenge rises far away in Britain. Its great stones will eventually become one of the world's most famous symbols of prehistory. People will wonder how they were moved, why they were arranged, what ceremonies took place among them. Yet Göbekli Tepe's monumental tradition reaches much farther into the past. Again, the buried hill says nothing. Bronze Age kingdoms rise and fall. Iron replaces bronze in many places. Empires cross. Anatolia. Armies march through landscapes once traveled by hunters. Languages change. Gods change. Borders change. The pillars do not. Centuries become millennia. Rome rises. Rome falls. Churches appear. Mosques appear. Caravans cross the region. Far away, towns such as York and Canterbury grow through their own long histories. People live and die in Cornwall, Edinburgh, Flanders, London, and Normandy. Your own ancestors, wherever they may have lived, passed through generations of hunger, marriage, work, illness, celebration, and ordinary evenings. And during all of it, the hill waits. This is one of the strangest effects of deep history. 11,000 years is easy to say. It is much harder to feel. Imagine one human lifetime, then another, then another. Imagine every grandparent passing a story to a grandchild. Now continue that chain for hundreds of generations. Eventually, the original story would become unrecognizable. Göbekli Tepe survives beyond the reach of continuous human memory. The builders disappear not because nobody cared about them, but because memory has limits. Stone lasts longer then. In the modern era, archaeology develops methods capable of asking the hill new questions. Researchers no longer need a surviving legend to know that something happened here. They can study stone tools, animal bones, architecture, sediment, plant remains, microscopic traces. They can compare styles, they can examine how walls intersect, they can study which layer came first, and, crucially, they can use radiocarbon dating on suitable organic material. Suddenly, the buried world acquires chronological depth. The great surprise of Göbekli Tepe is not simply that old stones exist. Human beings have used stone for an extraordinarily long time. The surprise is organization, planning, scale, symbolism. Monumental architecture appearing among communities living before the mature farming societies once thought necessary for projects of this kind. That challenges a comfortable story about civilization. The comfortable story goes like this. First comes agriculture, then surplus, then villages, then hierarchy, then religion becomes organized, then monumental architecture appears. It is a staircase. One step creates the next. Göbekli Tepe makes the staircase wobble. It suggests that large-scale communal ritual and coordinated construction can appear astonishingly early. People who still depend heavily on hunting and gathering can organize substantial labor. They can plan complicated structures, they can maintain symbolic traditions, they can bring communities together. And perhaps these gatherings themselves help encourage some of the changes leading towards settled life. The arrow of causation may point both ways. Agriculture can support ritual, but ritual gatherings can also create pressure for more reliable food. Settlement can support monuments, but monuments can also give people reasons to return repeatedly to the same landscape. Food changes society. Society changes food. Belief changes settlement. Settlement changes belief. This is messier than the staircase. It is also much closer to how human beings usually behave. History rarely moves because everyone agrees on one sensible plan. People respond to dozens of pressures at once. Hunger, weather, family, prestige, fear, curiosity, habit, memory, competition, love, death. The builders of Göbekli Tepe do not need to understand that they are participating in a transformation that future archaeologists will call the Neolithic. They only need reasons to return next season. And then there is the burial. Perhaps the most famous mystery of all. Why cover something so difficult to build after our long journey? The answer is both clearer and less satisfying than a mystery program might promise. We do not know one final reason. There may never have been one. Some structures may have been filled as they became old. Some filling may have served architectural purposes. Closure may have carried ritual meaning. Changing settlement patterns may have reduced the importance of the hill. New social systems may have made old communal spaces less useful. The symbolic world itself may have changed, and different people may have understood the same act differently. The person carrying rubble might think about work. The elder watching might think about ancestors. A child might think about dinner. Human motivation does not fossilize. That may be the single most important limitation to remember. Archaeology can sometimes tell us what people did with remarkable precision. It is much less certain about why. We can see that a pillar was carved. We cannot interview the carver. We can see that an enclosure was filled. We cannot ask the person carrying the basket whether the act felt sacred. We can see animal bones associated with human activity. We cannot hear the conversation around the meal. The past leaves nouns more easily than verbs: stone, bone, flint, wall, pillar, and it leaves emotions almost not at all: grief, pride, fear, reverence, boredom. Those survive only indirectly, yet perhaps that uncertainty is not a flaw. Perhaps it is what makes Göbekli Tepe worth returning to. If archaeologists found an inscription tomorrow explaining every pillar, naming every animal, describing every ceremony, and giving a tidy reason for every enclosure's closure, the site would become easier, but it would also become smaller. At present, the silence forces us to confront how little of human life survives. Think about one ordinary day in your own life. How much evidence would remain after 11,000 years? The cup you used might disappear. Your clothes would decay. The room might collapse. Your language could vanish. The music you heard would be gone. Your name might survive nowhere. A future archaeologist might recover a fragment of wall and a few durable objects. From those things, they would try to reconstruct you. They would get some things right, others terribly wrong. And the most important moments of your day might leave no physical trace at all. A joke, an apology, a promise. A thought you never spoke. The people of Göbekli Tepe had all of these things. Their archaeological invisibility does not make their lives simple. They loved people. They disliked people. They worried. They became tired. They experienced hunger. They watched children grow. They remembered parents who had died. They looked at the night sky. They argued about how work should be done. And occasionally they moved enormous pieces of limestone. Perhaps this is the most important change Göbekli Tepe brings to our view of prehistory. It makes very ancient people difficult to underestimate. Calling them hunter-gatherers describes how they obtained much of their food. It does not describe the limits of their imagination. They are capable of abstract thought, long-term planning, collective action, technical experimentation, art, ritual, memory, the construction of places whose meaning extends beyond immediate survival. In other words, they are deeply human, and this returns us to those two central pillars. Imagine them one last time while the enclosure is still open. Evening settles over the hill. People have gathered around the walls. Firelight touches the carvings. The central stones stand above everyone. Their carved arms descend along their sides. Their hands rest across their bodies. Their faces are blank. Perhaps someone speaks. Everyone listens. A fox waits on a nearby pillar. A bird spreads its carved form across another. Outside the enclosure, food is being prepared. Children are restless. The night is cooling. Nobody present thinks the scene is mysterious. Every symbol belongs somewhere inside their understanding of the world. The stones make sense. The animals make sense. The ceremony makes sense. And perhaps that is the greatest distance between them and us, not 11,000 years understanding. We possess technology they could never imagine. We can fly over the hill, map structures beneath the ground, analyze microscopic residues, measure radioactive decay, create detailed digital models of every carved surface, and still a person standing here 11,000 years ago knows something we do not. What it means. There is a gentle humility in that. Knowledge does not always accumulate neatly. Sometimes humanity gains extraordinary abilities while losing ordinary explanations. We know how old the pillar is. The builder knew why the fox was there. Neither person knows everything. Eventually, the enclosure is filled. The fire goes out, the pillars disappear, and the hill enters its long sleep. Thousands of years later, archaeologists remove the fill. Sunlight reaches limestone that has not seen daylight since the early Neolithic. A carved animal emerges. Then another, the upper part of a pillar appears. More soil is removed. Hands return. A belt, arms. The faceless being rises from the earth, not because it has moved, but because we have removed everything that concealed it. For the first time in thousands upon thousands of years, a human being stands before it again. And perhaps that modern archaeologist experiences something the ancient builders would recognize. A moment of silence, the sense that the stone matters, even if the reason has changed. Today, Göbekli Tepe remains a place of active research. New methods continue to refine interpretations. The broader region has revealed other early sites that help place the hill within a richer cultural landscape. This matters because Göbekli Tepe should not be imagined as a miracle appearing from nowhere. The people who built it belong to communities with traditions, neighbors, networks, skills, and histories of their own. The hill is extraordinary. Its builders are not supernatural. They are people working within a human world that archaeology is still slowly uncovering. And perhaps future discoveries will make Göbekli Tepe seem less isolated. Another site may preserve related imagery. Another settlement may reveal how ceremonial gatherings were organized. New analysis may clarify what people ate. New excavations may refine the history of particular enclosures. Some theories will disappear. Others will become stronger. That is how archaeology should work. A mystery is not protected by refusing answers. It becomes richer when weak explanations are removed. For now, the central question remains open enough to keep us company. Why did they bury Göbekli Tepe on purpose? Perhaps because its buildings had completed their lives. Perhaps because the society that created them was changing. Perhaps because burial protected sacred spaces from inappropriate reuse. Perhaps because new construction demanded old structures be filled. Perhaps because the community understood closure in ways we can no longer recover. Most likely, the answer lies somewhere among several causes rather than inside one dramatic secret. And strangely, that may be more beautiful. Because Göbekli Tepe does not give us a story about mysterious strangers possessing impossible knowledge. It gives us something better. A story about ordinary human beings doing extraordinary things for reasons that once felt completely ordinary to them. They gather, they hunt, they eat, they remember, they carve, they build, then the world changes. And when the old stones no longer belong beneath the open sky, they cover them. One basket, one bone, one flint fragment, one piece of limestone at a time, until the animals disappear, until the hands disappear, until the faceless heads disappear, until there is only a hill, and perhaps that is where we should leave them tonight. Not beneath spotlights in a museum, not inside a dramatic theory, but under the dark Anatolian sky. The last fire is almost gone. Someone walks down the slope toward home. Behind them, the old enclosure lies beneath fresh earth. They may turn once to look back, or perhaps they do not. Tomorrow, there is work. Grain to process, water to carry, children to feed. The future is arriving quietly, and beneath their feet, the past has already begun to sleep. For thousands of years, it will remain there, patient, silent, waiting for people who have forgotten the builders completely to arrive with brushes, notebooks, questions, and a language the stones have never heard. We uncover the pillars. We measure them. We photograph the animals. We date the deposits. And eventually, we ask the same question again. Why? The hill does not answer. The fox remains still. The snakes remain stone. And perhaps, after 11,000 years, silence is the only ending Göbekli Tepe was ever going to give us.